The alarm clock read 5:43 a.m. when Cameron Brooks opened his eyes in the darkness of his bedroom, 2 minutes before the buzzer would shatter what passed for sleep. He'd learned years ago that waking before the alarm gave him those extra seconds to prepare for consciousness, to remember where he was and why he was alone, to build the armor that would carry him through another day of performing normalcy for a 4-year-old who still asked when mommy was coming home. He silenced the alarm before it could sound muscle memory, guiding his hand in the pre-dawn blackness. The apartment was silent except for the ambient noise of Chicago waking up around him, traffic already building on South Halsted Street, 6 floors below the building's ancient heating system, clanking to life, someone in the unit above, running water through pipes that protested with sounds that suggested imminent, catastrophic failure. Cameron sat up, feet finding the floor, and allowed himself exactly 30 seconds of stillness before the day demanded motion. Those 30 seconds were his morning ritual, the brief window where he didn't have to be provider or protector or the single father holding together a life that had shattered 3 years ago on a rainy Thursday when a drunk driver ran a red light and destroyed his entire world in the time it took for steel to crumple and glass to shatter and his wife Rachel to stop breathing. 30 seconds. Then he stood and walked to the bathroom they shared with Lily's small bedroom, careful to be quiet because his daughter needed every minute of sleep she could get before Mrs. Rodriguez arrived at 6:15 to take her for the day. The mirror showed a man who looked older than 32, exhaustion written into features that used to be described as handsome back when Cameron had energy to care about his appearance. Brown hair that needed cutting, stubble that would have to wait for his day off to shave properly, shoulders that were broader than they'd been before he started working maintenance jobs that required lifting equipment designed to break your back. 3 justitrons. That was what it took to keep them afloat in an economy that treated single parents like expendable resources. Mornings he worked maintenance at the Regency Crown Hotel, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., $18 an hour, for keeping the infrastructure of luxury functioning, while wealthy guests complained about water pressure and demanded immediate solutions to problems that weren't actually problems. Afternoons he drove delivery routes for a logistics company that paid $14.50 per hour plus bonuses if you hit impossible quotas, while navigating Chicago traffic that made every route feel like combat. Evenings when he could get the shifts, he picked up catering work or equipment repairs, cash jobs that didn't appear on tax forms, in which Cameron justified by telling himself that survival required moral flexibility. $42,000 a year gross income, $180,000 in debt from Rachel's medical bills and the funeral costs, and the 3 months when Cameron couldn't work because grief had made him non-functional. The math didn't work. Every month was triage, deciding which bills could be delayed and which creditors would actually sue versus those who'd just send threatening letters that Cameron had learned to ignore. But Lily had food and clothes and a roof over her head, and that was what mattered. That was the only thing that mattered when Cameron woke at 5:43 a.m. and built his armor and prepared to spend another day making himself small enough to be invisible to people who'd never had to choose between electricity and groceries. He dressed in the uniform that the Regency Crown provided: navy blue work pants, matching button-up shirt with the hotel logo embroidered over the heart, steel-toed boots that were supposed to last 6 months, but which Cameron had been stretching into their 18th month of service. The shirt was clean because Cameron did laundry every Sunday night without fail, but the fabric was worn thin at the elbows and collar, the blue fading to something closer to gray under fluorescent lights. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person to move comfortably, a galley layout with appliances that belonged to the landlord, and which Cameron wasn't allowed to replace, even though the refrigerator made sounds that suggested sentience and malice. He started coffee in the machine Rachel had insisted on buying 3 years before she died, one of those single-serve pod systems that was environmentally irresponsible, but which Cameron couldn't bring up himself to get rid of, because Rachel had loved her morning coffee, and sometimes keeping her ghost alive meant keeping her appliances. While the coffee brewed, Cameron checked his phone. 3 texts from his delivery company supervisor asking if he could add an extra route today. Someone had called in sick and they needed coverage. Cameron calculated quickly. Extra route meant 4 more hours, roughly $60 after taxes, and Mrs. Rodriguez had already said she could keep Lily until 8 p.m. if needed. $60 was a week of groceries if he shopped carefully. He texted back confirming he'd take the shift. The coffee finished. Cameron drank it black, standing over the sink, too expensive to waste on cream, that would spoil before he used it all. Through the window above the sink, the city was transitioning from night to dawn, streetlights still glowing against a sky that was shifting from black to deep blue. In 6 hours, he'd be navigating delivery routes through Christmas shoppers who'd forgotten what patience meant. In 14 hours, he'd collapse into bed and sleep until the alarm went off at 5:43 a.m. and the cycle repeated. Lily's bedroom door was decorated with construction paper drawings she'd made in preschool flowers and hearts, and stick figures that were supposed to represent their family. Cameron paused outside, listening to her breathing through the door, the sound that had kept him tethered to sanity in the months after Rachel died, when grief suggested that maybe survival wasn't worth the effort. He opened the door quietly. Lily slept in her toddler bed, buried under blankets that featured cartoon characters Cameron didn't recognize, but which had been on sale at Target. Her blonde hair, Rachel's hair not his, splayed across the pillow, small face peaceful in ways that only children could manage. She clutched her stuffed elephant, the one Rachel had bought when they found out they were having a girl back, when their biggest worry was whether the nursery color scheme matched and whether they were prepared for parenthood. They hadn't been prepared for parenthood. Nobody was, not really, but Rachel had been better at it than Cameron, natural maternal instincts that made her the parent Lily ran to first when she fell, or when nightmares came, or when she needed someone to understand emotions that 4-year-olds couldn't articulate. Now Lily only had Cameron, who'd learned through trial and error to do his best impression of both parents while constantly failing to be either one adequately. Cameron left Lily sleeping and returned to the kitchen, where he prepared her lunch for preschool peanut butter sandwich, because the school didn't have nut allergies this semester. Apple slices because fruit was required, juice box that was mostly sugar, but which Lily would actually drink. He packed it in the lunchbox that had frozen characters on it, then wrote a note on a napkin the way Rachel used to do. "Lily Bug, you're the bravest girl I know. Love, Daddy." The notes were a ritual he'd maintained for 8 months now, ever since he had found the box of notes Rachel had written for Lily before she died, messages she'd prepared, knowing she might not survive long enough to deliver them in person. Cameron's notes weren't as good as Rachel's had been. He wasn't creative enough, didn't have her way with words, but he wrote them anyway because Lily needed to know someone was thinking about her during the hours when Cameron couldn't be there. At 6:13 a.m., Mrs. Rodriguez knocked 3 times in the pattern that meant everything was routine and safe. Cameron opened the door to find his neighbor standing in the hallway wearing the quilted bathrobe she lived in during winter months, her gray hair in curlers, holding the thermal mug of tea she brought with her every morning. Mrs. Rodriguez was 71 years old, retired from teaching elementary school, living alone since her husband died 6 years ago. She'd started watching Lily 2 years ago when Cameron's previous childcare arrangement fell through, and he'd been desperate enough to knock on her door and beg. She'd agreed to help temporarily, then temporary became permanent, then permanent became family. Her voice was soft, accented with the Spanish she'd spoken growing up in Puerto Rico before moving to Chicago in her 20s. "Mijo, you look terrible. Are you sleeping?" Cameron managed something approximating a smile. "Working. Same thing these days." "Not the same thing. Working is what you do during the day. Sleeping is what you do at night so you don't collapse." She stepped inside, assessing him with the same sharp eyes she'd probably used on students who tried to lie about homework. "When was the last time you took a day off? I'll take one when they start paying me enough to afford it." Mrs. Rodriguez made the disapproving sound that Cameron had learned meant she wanted to argue but recognized futility. Instead, she moved toward Lily's room with practiced efficiency, someone who'd been doing this routine long enough that she didn't need instructions. Cameron followed, watching as Mrs. Rodriguez gently woke Lily with the same patience Rachel used to have. His daughter's eyes opened, slowly, confused for the few seconds it took her brain to transition from sleep to waking, then focusing on Mrs. Rodriguez with recognition that immediately shifted to something that made Cameron's chest ache. "Is today the day Mommy comes back?" Lily's voice was sleep-rough but hopeful in ways that broke Cameron's heart every single time she asked the question she asked at least twice a week, despite every gentle explanation he had offered about how death meant not coming back. Mrs. Rodriguez glanced at Cameron with an expression that mixed sympathy and concern, then turned back to Lily with practiced deflection. "Today is Tuesday, mija. On Tuesdays, we have pancakes for breakfast, and then we go to the library. Remember, you wanted to get more books about cats." The redirection worked because 4-year-olds could be diverted by routine and promises of favorite things. Lily climbed out of bed, elephant clutched tight, and allowed Mrs. Rodriguez to guide her toward getting dressed, while Cameron stood in the doorway feeling like he'd failed at another small piece of parenting that Rachel would have handled better. He left at 6:28 a.m. with Lily still in her pajamas and Mrs. Rodriguez making reassuring sounds about pancakes and library trips. The commute to the Regency Crown took 43 minutes on the L train when trains ran on schedule longer when they didn't, which was most days. Cameron stood pressed between other early morning commuters who all shared the same exhausted expressions and the same careful avoidance of eye contact that characterized urban survival. The Regency Crown Hotel occupied 12 floors of downtown Chicago real estate that cost more per square foot than Cameron would earn in his lifetime. The building was all glass and steel and architectural statements about wealth, the kind of luxury establishment where guests paid $700 per night for rooms Cameron could fit his entire apartment inside. The lobby featured marble floors imported from Italy, crystal chandeliers worth more than his yearly salary and furniture arranged in conversation groups that nobody ever used because wealthy people didn't come to hotels to socialize with strangers. Cameron entered through the service entrance on the building's north side, the pathway designed to keep staff invisible to guests who shouldn't have to acknowledge the humans who maintain their luxury. The employee break room was in the basement, a space with flickering fluorescent lights and folding chairs and a coffee machine that produced liquid that tasted like regret. His manager, Kevin, was already there nursing coffee and reviewing work orders on a clipboard that had seen better decades. Kevin was 47, balding with the permanently stressed expression of someone who'd realized too late that hospitality management was just professional problem solving for ungrateful people. He looked up when Cameron entered. "Brooks, good timing. We've got a situation in the presidential suite. Guest is complaining that the shower pressure isn't adequate." Kevin's tone suggested he knew the complaint was ridiculous, but they'd be addressing it anyway because guests who paid $2,000 per night got their shower pressure issues treated like national emergencies. Cameron nodded, already calculating the time this would take versus the dozen other issues that actually required attention. What do they mean by inadequate? Not hot enough or not enough volume? They said it feels weak, probably just need to check the valve restrictor. Kevin handed Cameron the work order with room number and details written in the shorthand that hotel maintenance staff developed over years of addressing problems that weren't actually problems. "Try to get this done before 8 when the day manager arrives. She's already on edge about Christmas gala preparations." The Christmas gala, right. That was tonight, the annual event where Chicago's wealthy elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their charitable donations while drinking champagne that cost more per bottle than Cameron earned in a day. The hotel had been preparing for weeks, transforming the ballroom into something that magazine photographers would describe as elegant, in which Cameron thought looked like someone had weaponized glitter and good taste. He took his tool bag from his locker and headed up the service elevator to the 12th floor, where the presidential suite occupied the entire northwest corner, with views of Lake Michigan that wealthy people paid premium rates to ignore while checking their phones. The guest who'd complained about water pressure wasn't in the suite, probably at breakfast spending $30 on eggs. So Cameron let himself in with his master key and went to work on a problem that took him 8 minutes to solve and which hadn't actually been a problem in the first place. The next 6 hours passed in the rhythm Cameron had learned to navigate without conscious thought. Broken ice machine on the 8th floor that just needed its filter replaced. Clogged toilet in room 412 that required professional discretion and absolutely no commentary about what guests flushed. Light fixture in the conference room that had burned out and which required a ladder and 20 minutes to replace with bulb that cost the hotel 14 cents and which they'd bill to their corporate client at $15. Cameron moved through the hotel's infrastructure like ghost present, but unnoticed by guests who looked through him with the practiced invisibility that wealth taught you to deploy towards service workers. A woman in designer clothes held the elevator door for him, once smiled with the careful politeness that said she recognized he was human, but preferred not to think too hard about the economic gulf between them. A businessman complained about hallway noise while Cameron was repairing a door lock, then walked away mid-conversation when his phone rang, as if Cameron would simply vanish when no longer needed. It was fine. Being invisible was survival strategy, in spaces where visibility meant being blamed for things beyond your control. Cameron had learned to wear his uniform like camouflage, to speak only when spoken to complete his work with competence. That was noted but never praised because praise required acknowledging that service workers were people rather than functions. Lunch was 15 minutes in the break room, eating the sandwich he'd packed because the hotel cafeteria charged employee prices that Cameron couldn't afford. He sat alone scrolling through his phone, checking texts from Mrs. Rodriguez confirming Lily had eaten lunch and was currently napping, checking the delivery company app to see tomorrow's route assignments, checking his bank account, and watching the balance hover just above the threshold that would trigger overdraft fees. At 1:47 p.m., Kevin found him replacing air filters in the HVAC closet on the 6th floor. His manager's expression suggested news that wouldn't improve Cameron's day. "Brooks, I need a favor." The phrasing was request, but the tone was command disguised as polite inquiry. "Night shift maintenance called out sick. I need someone to cover the Christmas gala tonight. 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. time and a half." Cameron's mind calculated automatically. 8 hours at $27 per hour. $216 before taxes, roughly $180 after. That was groceries for 2 weeks plus Lily's preschool supply fee that was due Friday. But it also meant calling Mrs. Rodriguez to ask if she could keep Lily overnight, meant rescheduling the delivery route he'd agreed to cover, meant another day of running on too little sleep. He agreed before his common sense could argue. "I'll take it. What do you need me to do?" Kevin's relief was visible. "Mostly just be available. Keep the service elevators running, handle any issues that come up. The event coordinators will be running around panicking about centerpieces and lighting, but your job is making sure the actual infrastructure doesn't fail. Should be easy money." Easy money. That was what managers said about shifts that were never actually easy, that always included complications nobody predicted and problems that required solutions beyond what training manuals covered. But Cameron needed the money more than he needed to point out that Kevin was being optimistic about how events actually went. He called Mrs. Rodriguez during his break, explained the situation with the apologies that came from asking too many favors from someone who'd already given too much. She agreed immediately because Mrs. Rodriguez was a better person than Cameron deserved, told him not to worry about Lily, said something about how God provided opportunities to those who worked hard enough. Cameron wasn't sure he believed in God anymore, hadn't since Rachel died, in ways that suggested either God didn't exist or didn't care, but he thanked Mrs. Rodriguez anyway because arguing theology with a woman who'd sacrificed her evening for you seemed ungrateful. The delivery company supervisor was less understanding when Cameron called to cancel the extra route, reminded him that reliability was important for contractors who wanted to keep getting shifts, suggested perhaps Cameron should reconsider his priorities. Cameron listened to the lecture while counting the $216 he'd earned tonight versus the $60 he'd lose from canceling delivery, reminded himself that math mattered more than pride. Apologized for the inconvenience and promised it wouldn't happen again, even though they both knew it probably would. At 2:08 p.m., his regular maintenance shift ended. Cameron had 3 hours before the gala shift started, time he'd normally spend on delivery routes, but which now stretched empty. He could go home, try to sleep, but the apartment felt too quiet without Lily, and sleep had been elusive lately, even when exhaustion suggested it should come easily. Instead, he rode the L train to the preschool, where Lily attended half-days on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the state-subsidized program and that was supposed to prepare children for kindergarten, but which mostly just gave working parents somewhere safe to leave their kids for a few hours. The building was old, funding clearly inadequate based on the peeling paint and the playground equipment that had been obsolete 20 years ago. But the teachers were kind and the children were supervised, and Lily came home happy most days, which was all Cameron could afford to care about. He stood outside the chain-link fence watching Lily play with other 4-year-olds whose names he didn't know. His daughter was smaller than the other children's genetics from Rachel's family, giving her delicate features and slight build that made her look younger than she was. She played alone, mostly sitting in the sandbox, making structures from damp sand, while other children ran and shouted around her. The isolation worried Cameron in ways he couldn't articulate to people who'd ask. Lily had been social before Rachel died, eager to engage with other children, quick to laugh and play. After the accident, she'd withdrawn into herself, developed caution that suggested she understood on some level that the world took things away without warning. Cameron didn't know how to help her beyond being present and patient and hoping that time would heal wounds he couldn't see but knew existed. A teacher noticed him and waved the gesture friendly, but also questioning why a parent was standing outside watching, instead of picking up their child. Cameron waved back and walked away before the situation could become conversation that required explaining why he had 3 hours to kill before his next shift and had decided to spend them watching his daughter play in sand. He found a coffee shop 2 blocks away, the kind of independent establishment that charged $6 for drinks that Cameron could make at home for 50 cents, but which provided Wi-Fi and tables where customers could sit for hours without being asked to leave. He ordered black coffee because it was the cheapest item on the menu and found a corner table away from the windows where late afternoon sun wouldn't make reading his phone screen impossible. Email inbox showed 17 unread messages, mostly automated notifications from creditors who'd given up expecting payment and had moved into the threatening language phase. Cameron deleted them without reading. Student loan servicer wanting to discuss repayment options. Medical billing company suggesting payment plans that would stretch into decades. Credit card company that Rachel had opened 3 years ago for emergency expenses and which still carried the $5,000 balance from her funeral costs. All of it theoretical debt that existed in digital records, but which didn't affect daily survival as long as Cameron ignored it aggressively enough. Eventually, they'd sue or garnish his wages or do whatever creditors did to poor people who couldn't pay, but that was future Cameron's problem. Present Cameron just needed to make sure Lily had dinner tonight and breakfast tomorrow, and all the small certainties that made childhood stable. His phone buzzed with text from Kevin. Need you here by 5:30 for gala briefing. Event coordinator wants to review emergency protocols. Cameron glanced at the time, 4:47 p.m. He had 43 minutes to get back to the Regency Crown and enough time if the trains ran on schedule, cutting it close if they didn't. He drained the coffee that had gone cold, left the cup on the table because bussing it himself felt like doing work he wasn't being paid for, and headed back into the December evening that had arrived while he sat trying to pretend he had somewhere better to be. Victoria Sterling's office occupied the entire southwest corner of the Sterling Capital Group headquarters, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of Chicago's financial district that Victoria had stopped noticing years ago. The space was decorated with the kind of aggressive minimalism that interior designers called sophisticated, and which Victoria thought made the office feel like an expensive waiting room. Glass desk that seemed to float leather chairs that had cost $8,000 each, abstract art on the walls that Victoria had purchased because her decorator insisted, and which she'd never actually looked at with any real attention. 32 years old, chief executive officer of a company worth $2 billion, featured in Forbes and Fortune and all the publications that celebrated women in business, while simultaneously questioning whether they were tough enough to compete with men. The youngest female CEO in Chicago, according to Crane's Business, which had done a profile 6 months ago that focused almost entirely on her appearance and her romantic status, rather than the 15% revenue growth she'd achieved in 18 months. The Ice Queen. That was what the business press called her, the nickname that had started as criticism, but which Victoria had learned to weaponize. Better to be cold and competent than warm and dismissed. Better to be feared than loved, when love just meant people thought they could take advantage of your emotions. Her executive assistant, Sarah, knocked twice before entering the rhythm that meant something required immediate attention but wasn't catastrophic. Sarah was 43, efficient to the point of being slightly terrifying, the kind of person who anticipated problems before they materialized and who'd been running interference for Victoria since day one as CEO. Thomas called, third time today. He wants to discuss the Meridian Holdings vote. Sarah's tone was carefully neutral, the professionalism that meant she had opinions about Victoria's father, but was too disciplined to voice them directly. Victoria kept her eyes on the contract she'd been reviewing, financial projections for the Meridian Holdings partnership that would inject $2 billion into Sterling Capital and cement Victoria's position as legitimate CEO rather than daughter playing at running daddy's company. Tell him I'm in meetings until 6. He knows you're not in meetings. He called your cell phone twice. Then tell him I'm not biting his calls until he stops trying to undermine me with the board. Sarah's expression didn't change, but Victoria could feel the judgment radiating from her assistant like heat from a furnace. Sarah had worked for Thomas Sterling before Victoria had watched the company founder build his empire from single-hangar aviation operation in 1988 through 37 years of aggressive expansion into the diversified capital group it was today. She had complicated loyalty that included both father and daughter, but which clearly preferred the father's management style to the daughter's. He's worried about the vote. 3 board members are still uncommitted. Sarah's voice carried the subtext that Thomas's worry might be justified, that perhaps Victoria should be more concerned about the internal opposition than she was showing. Victoria finally looked up from the contract, letting Sarah see the exhaustion she'd been hiding from everyone else today. The uncommitted members are stalling because they're waiting to see which way the wind blows. Once we close the Meridian deal, they'll fall in line because nobody votes against success. Unless Marcus convinces them that the deal is a mistake. There it was, the name that had been hovering beneath every conversation Victoria had been having for 6 months, the ghost that haunted Sterling Capital's boardroom, despite no longer having official role in the company. Marcus Ashford, her former fiancé, the venture capitalist her father had groomed as protege and potential son-in-law, the man who was supposed to marry Victoria and help run the empire Thomas was building. Except Victoria had proven more capable than Marcus at every turn, had surpassed his projections, and outmaneuvered his strategies until it became clear that Sterling Capital needed one leader, not 2. Thomas had chosen his daughter, and Marcus had responded by making himself indispensable, in other ways, cultivating relationships with board members, positioning himself as trusted advisor, ensuring that even after Victoria broke their engagement and effectively forced him out of day-to-day operations, his influence remained embedded in the company's power structure. For 6 months, Marcus had been systematically dismantling what Victoria was trying to build. Not overtly, that would be too obvious, too easy to counter. Instead, he operated through whisper campaigns and strategic lunches with board members planting seeds of doubt about Victoria's judgment, questioning whether she was emotionally stable enough to handle the pressure of running a multi-billion-dollar organization, suggesting that perhaps Thomas should consider returning from semi-retirement to provide steadier leadership. And it was working. Not completely, not yet, but Victoria could feel the ground shifting beneath her, the way sailors reportedly felt the sea change before storms arrived. Board members who'd been loyal were starting to ask careful questions. Investors who'd committed capital were requesting additional assurances. The business press that had celebrated her appointment was now publishing think pieces about whether she'd proven herself or just been coasting on her father's reputation. The Meridian Holdings partnership was supposed to end the speculation. $2 billion in committed capital expansion into markets. Sterling Capital had never penetrated validation from one of the most respected investment groups in the country. Once that deal closed, Marcus's whisper campaign would lose credibility because success was the only argument that mattered in business. But closing the deal required board approval, and board approval required convincing uncommitted members that Victoria was making the right strategic move, and convincing them was difficult when Marcus was simultaneously working to undermine their confidence in her judgment. Sarah was still standing in the doorway, waiting for instructions that Victoria didn't have. Finally, Victoria closed the contract and made a decision that felt like surrender, but which was actually just pragmatism. Set up lunch with Thomas tomorrow. Tell him I want to discuss board strategy. Sarah nodded and disappeared, leaving Victoria alone in her expensive office with views she didn't appreciate and furniture she didn't care about. She pulled up her phone and scrolled through recent calls, confirming what she already knew. Thomas had indeed called 3 times today. Marcus had called twice using the number Victoria had blocked, but which apparently he'd replaced. And her younger sister Claire had texted asking if Victoria was still coming to Christmas dinner, which was now 10 days away, and which Victoria had been avoiding committing to. The Sterling family Christmas. That would be fun. Thomas would spend the entire meal making pointed comments about business decisions he disagreed with. Marcus would somehow be invited because Thomas couldn't quite let go of the protege he'd invested 15 years grooming. Claire would ask intrusive questions about Victoria's personal life while simultaneously judging her for not having one. And Victoria would sit there performing the role of daughter and sister, incompetent executive, while internally screaming about the suffocating weight of expectations she'd never asked for, but had inherited anyway. Her phone buzzed with reminder Christmas gala tonight at the Regency Crown Hotel, 7 p.m. Start black tie, required attendance mandatory because Meridian Holdings executives would be there, and this was the opportunity to demonstrate that Sterling Capital was stable and professional despite whatever rumors Marcus was spreading. Victoria had been dreading the gala for weeks. Not because she disliked events, she'd learned to perform charm and confidence at business functions the same way she performed everything else. But because Marcus would definitely be there, would find ways to corner her in conversations that looked friendly to observers, but which were actually psychological warfare disguised as small talk. She'd broken their engagement 8 months ago after discovering that Marcus had been systematically positioning himself to take over Sterling Capital. Once they were married, not overtly hostile takeover, just strategic maneuvering that would have resulted in Thomas retiring, Victoria transitioning to some symbolic role, and Marcus becoming de facto CEO of the company Victoria had been trained to run since she was 14 years old. When she'd confronted him with the evidence board meeting notes, strategic memos, conversations with investors, where Marcus positioned himself as the real power behind Sterling Capital, he'd looked genuinely surprised that she was upset. As if consolidating power after marriage was natural progression of their relationship rather than betrayal of everything she'd worked for. She'd called off the wedding 3 weeks before the ceremony, lost deposits on venue and catering and flowers, faced questions from guests who'd already made travel plans, endured sympathetic comments from business acquaintances who assumed Marcus had broken her heart rather than understanding she'd broken his ambitions. His response had been calm, measured, terrifying. "You'll regret this. Everything you think you've built, I helped construct. Without me, you'll discover how fragile it all is." For 6 months, he'd been proving his point. Piece by piece, relationship by relationship, whisper by whisper, he was dismantling her credibility and demonstrating that perhaps she couldn't run Sterling Capital without the man her father had spent 15 years grooming for exactly that purpose. The stalking had started gradually. Phone calls that Marcus claimed were about business, but which Victoria recognized as attempts to maintain control. Appearing at her office building's lobby during lunch hours, always with plausible excuse about meeting someone else, but somehow present when Victoria was leaving. Showing up at her gym at 5 a.m., coincidentally using the equipment near hers, making casual conversation that felt scripted. Nothing illegal, nothing that would justify restraining order. Just steady pressure reminding Victoria that Marcus knew her schedule, knew her routines, knew how to appear in her life without invitation and without consequence. Sarah returned with tablet, showing Victoria's schedule for the rest of the day. Hair and makeup arrive at 5:30, car service at 6:45. Gala begins at 7, but Meridian executives aren't arriving until 7:30 per their assistant. Victoria nodded, already mentally exhausting the performance she'd be delivering tonight. The smile that looked genuine, the small talk that seemed effortless, the confidence that suggested she absolutely wasn't being systematically destroyed by her ex-fiancé, while her father questioned whether she deserved to run his company. Anything else? Sarah hesitated. The pause that meant she was about to overstep boundaries in ways that technically exceeded her role as assistant, but which she'd do anyway because someone needed to say uncomfortable truths. "You look exhausted. When was the last time you slept properly?" "I'll sleep when Marcus stops trying to destroy my company." "That's not sustainable, and you know it. You're running yourself into the ground, and eventually the board will notice, and then Marcus won't need to whisper campaign because your collapse will be obvious to everyone." The words were harsh but accurate, the kind of honesty that Victoria paid Sarah to deliver even when she didn't want to hear it. But knowing Sarah was right didn't change the fundamental mathematics of survival. There were only 24 hours in a day, and Victoria needed all of them to fight battles on multiple fronts simultaneously. "I'll take a vacation after Meridian closes. Beach somewhere, disconnect completely." The promise was lie they both recognized, but neither acknowledged directly. Sarah left, and Victoria returned to reviewing contracts, financial projections that blurred together as exhaustion made concentration difficult. She had 3 hours before she needed to start preparing for the gala, 3 hours to accomplish work that required 3 hours to be CEO instead of woman who was being systematically destroyed by man who'd claimed to love her. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number, Chicago area code. Victoria almost declined until she saw the preview of the text message that made her stomach drop. "Looking forward to seeing you tonight. We should talk about the Meridian deal. M. Marcus." Using a new number she hadn't blocked yet, demonstrating once again that he knew exactly where she'd be and when, that her schedule wasn't private, that even her attempts to avoid him could be circumvented with minimal effort. Victoria deleted the message and blocked the number, aware that Marcus would just acquire another one and repeat the pattern tomorrow. The phone buzzed immediately with second message from different unknown number. Blocking me doesn't change anything. You still need me whether you admit it or not. She threw the phone across the office, watched it hit the expensive leather couch, and bounce onto carpet that cost $800 per square foot. Stood and walked to the windows where Chicago sprawled beneath her like circuit board of illuminated possibilities that all felt impossibly distant. Thomas Sterling had built this empire from nothing, had taken a single hangar aviation operation and transformed it through decades of strategic acquisitions and partnerships into the diversified capital group that bore his name. He'd trained Victoria from adolescence, had taught her financial analysis and market strategy, and all the skills that made her capable of running the business he'd created. But he'd also groomed Marcus as his successor, had invested 15 years developing the protege, who was supposed to marry his daughter, and ensure that Sterling Capital remained family-controlled even as Thomas retired. When Victoria proved more competent than Marcus, Thomas had chosen her for CEO, but he'd never quite let go of the vision where Marcus was integral to the company's future. That ambivalence was what Marcus exploited. Every whisper campaign included references to how Thomas had intended for Marcus to be involved. Every board meeting where Victoria's judgment was questioned included subtle reminders that Thomas himself had doubts. Every strategic decision Victoria made was compared unfavorably to how Marcus would have handled it, as if the man who'd tried to stage a boardroom coup was somehow more trustworthy than the daughter who'd spent 27 years preparing for this role. Victoria retrieved her phone from where it had landed on the couch. The screen was uncracked. Apparently $800 phones could survive being thrown by frustrated CEOs, and showed 3 more texts from 3 more unknown numbers, all variations on the same theme of Marcus, reminding her he was still present in her life, whether she wanted him there or not. She blocked all 3 numbers and turned off text notifications, entirely aware this was treating symptoms rather than disease, but lacking energy for more comprehensive solutions. The gala was in 4 hours. She needed to be composed, confident, charming. Needed to convince Meridian Holdings executives that Sterling Capital was exactly the stable, professionally managed organization they wanted to partner with. And she needed to do all of that while Marcus circulated through the same event, having the same conversations, subtly undermining everything Victoria was trying to build. Sarah appeared in the doorway again, this time with expression that suggested genuine concern rather than professional worry. Hair and makeup are here early. Should I send them in or give you more time? Victoria checked her reflection in the window, seeing the exhaustion that cosmetics would temporarily hide. Send them in. I need all the help I can get. Victoria, Sarah's voice carried weight that made it command rather than suggestion. You can't keep doing this. The pace, the stress fighting Marcus while trying to run the company. Something has to give. If something gives, I lose everything. So I'll keep going until either I win or I collapse, and I'm betting on winning. Sarah looked like she wanted to argue but recognized futility when she saw it. Instead, she sent in the hair and makeup team, 2 women who arrived with cases of products designed to transform exhausted executives into magazine-ready versions of themselves. They worked with practiced efficiency while Victoria sat motionless, performing the role of mannequin while her mind raced through scenarios for tonight's gala. Arrive early, establish presence before Marcus can corner her. Find Meridian executives immediately demonstrate confidence and competence. Minimize time Marcus could interrupt conversations. Have Sarah position herself as interference running blocking patterns that looked natural but which prevented prolonged contact. The strategy was solid but also exhausting to contemplate, another performance added to the endless performances that constituted Victoria's life. Be the CEO. Be the daughter. Be the woman who didn't need anyone's help. Be strong enough that weakness never showed. Be perfect enough that nobody questioned whether she deserved what she'd spent 27 years earning. At 6:42 p.m., Victoria's reflection in the mirror showed someone who looked nothing like the exhausted woman who'd thrown her phone 3 hours ago. Hair styled in elegant, updo makeup, transforming features into magazine cover version of herself, wearing black dress that had cost $4,000 and which made her look like exactly the kind of powerful woman who ran billion-dollar companies. The performance was ready. Now she just needed to execute it for 5 hours while Marcus tried to destroy everything she was fighting to protect. The Regency Crown's ballroom had been transformed into something that belonged in magazine spreads about luxury events that normal people would never attend. Crystal chandeliers reflected light across hardwood floors, polished to mirror shine tables, arranged around the perimeter, draped in white linens, centerpieces featuring white roses and holly that probably cost more than Cameron's monthly rent. A string quartet played something classical in the corner, adding soundtrack to wealth that thought itself cultured. Cameron stood near the service corridor entrance, wearing his maintenance uniform, and feeling acutely aware that he didn't belong in spaces like this, except as invisible support staff keeping infrastructure functional, while wealthy people congratulated themselves on their charitable donations. The event coordinator had briefed him and two other maintenance workers 20 minutes ago, emphasizing that they were to remain unseen unless specifically needed, respond immediately to any issues, and under no circumstances interrupt guests who were networking and socializing. Easy money. That was what Kevin had promised. And so far, the evening had been exactly that, standing around being ready for emergencies that hadn't materialized. Cameron's job was monitoring the service elevators and responding to maintenance issues, which currently meant standing near the ballroom entrance, watching Chicago's elite arrive in designer clothes that cost more than his car. The guests fell into recognizable categories based on years of Cameron observing wealth from service position. Old money that carried itself with casual confidence of people who'd never worried about rent. New money that worked harder at looking wealthy, designer labels, visible conversations louder. Corporate executives in expensive suits discussing business like war. Younger professionals trying to network their way into rooms they didn't quite belong in yet. And then there was the woman who arrived at 7:04 p.m., drawing attention simply by existing in ways that suggested she was accustomed to being the most important person in any room she entered. Cameron noticed her because everyone noticed her tall woman, with blonde hair pulled back in elegant style, wearing black dress that looked simple until you recognized the kind of tailoring that cost thousands of dollars. She moved with the confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and being comfortable with that knowledge. No hesitation in her stride as she entered the ballroom and immediately began greeting people with practiced ease. She looked familiar in ways Cameron couldn't quite place, face recognizable from contexts he couldn't access through the fog of exhaustion that made thinking difficult. Someone famous, or at least famous adjacent, the kind of person whose photograph appeared in business publications Cameron didn't read. The woman circulated through the room with practiced efficiency, spending exactly the right amount of time with each group before moving to the next, performing warmth that looked genuine, but which Cameron recognized as professional skill. She laughed at appropriate moments, touched arms with casual familiarity that suggested intimacy without crossing boundaries, maintained perfect posture that communicated confidence without arrogance. Cameron watched from his position near the service corridor, fascinated despite himself by the performance of wealth and power. This was a woman who'd learned to weaponize charm, who understood that business happened in rooms like this, rather than boardrooms, who knew that the right conversation at a Christmas gala could be worth millions in contracts and partnerships. She paused near the windows overlooking Chicago's skyline, accepting champagne from a server who materialized with the timing that suggested staff had been briefed about her preferences. For just a moment, her composure slipped, exhaustion visible in the way her shoulders dropped fraction of an inch, guard lowering when she thought nobody was watching. Then she saw something across the room that made her entire body tense. Cameron followed her gaze to see a man in expensive suit standing near the ballroom entrance, scanning the crowd with expression that suggested he was looking for someone specific. The man was late 30s, silver hair at temples that made him look distinguished, wearing confidence that felt performative rather than natural. Cameron watched the woman's reaction, the way her hand tightened on the champagne glass, the way her breathing changed, the way she started looking for exits, with the subtle desperation of someone who just recognized threat. This wasn't business rival or uncomfortable acquaintance. This was fear manifesting in someone who'd learned to hide fear so effectively that most people would miss the signs. The woman turned and started walking toward the service corridor, where Cameron stood, movements quick. Without being obvious, someone retreating while trying not to appear like they were retreating. Hurried, swept the room one more time, confirming that the man hadn't seen her yet. Then she ducked behind the column where Cameron was standing. Up close, she was younger than he had initially thought, early 30s maybe, though expensive skincare and professional styling made age difficult to assess. Her breathing was rapid, controlled panic that she was fighting to suppress. And when she looked up at Cameron, her eyes showed something he recognized from his own reflection in mirrors after Rachel died. Terror, absolute terror, barely contained by will and social conditioning. Her hands shot out and grabbed Cameron's collar with surprising strength for someone wearing an evening gown. Her voice was low, urgent, carrying authority that suggested she was used to giving orders that people followed immediately. Pretend to be my husband. Right now. Cameron's brain stuttered, trying to process the request that made no sense, opening his mouth to ask what she was talking about when she pulled him closer and kissed him. The lobby didn't fall silent. Cameron would remember later that conversations continued. Music kept playing. The event proceeded exactly as it had been before. But in his awareness, everything stopped except the sensation of being kissed by a stranger in front of 200 people who were now definitely noticing the blonde woman in the black dress kissing a maintenance worker near the service corridor. The kiss lasted maybe 5 seconds. To Cameron, it felt like falling through ice into dark water, disorientation and cold, and the immediate understanding that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't predict. When she finally pulled back, her hand was still gripping his collar, and he could feel her trembling, with the kind of full-body shaking that came from nervous system in complete revolt. Across the room, the silver-haired man stood frozen, face draining of color as he processed what he was seeing. His expression cycled through shock to disbelief to something darker that Cameron couldn't quite identify, but which looked like rage carefully suppressed beneath social conditioning. The woman was still gripping Cameron's collar, still trembling, still looking at him with eyes that begged for help even as her voice came out commanding. "Come with me." She pulled him toward the service corridor, movements quick without running, someone executing strategic retreat that was supposed to look casual. Cameron followed because his brain hadn't caught up with events yet, because the woman clearly needed help, because instinct that had once made him good at emergency response was screaming that this situation required immediate action, even if he didn't understand what that action should be. The service corridor was utilitarian contrast to the ballroom's luxury concrete floor, exposed pipes, fluorescent lights that buzzed with frequency suggesting imminent failure. The woman released Cameron's collar and leaned against the wall, breathing like she'd just finished marathon. Up close, without the ballroom's strategic lighting and her public performance, she looked younger and more vulnerable. The perfect styling couldn't quite hide the exhaustion in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands shook as she pressed palms against the concrete wall, like she needed physical contact with something solid to anchor herself. Cameron found his voice, finally words coming out confused and concerned in equal measure. "What are you doing?" She pressed palms against her eyes, composure cracking further. "I'm sorry, God, I'm so sorry. I just saw him and I panicked." "Saw who?" "My ex-fiancé. He's been following me for months. And when I saw him tonight, I needed to do something that would throw him off, something he wouldn't expect." She lowered her hands, eyes red-rimmed, mascara starting to smudge, despite whatever expensive waterproof formula her makeup artist had used. "So you kissed a complete stranger?" "Yes, and I know that's insane, but I was out of options and you were there and—" She paused and Cameron saw recognition flash across her face. "You've always been kind to me." That stopped him because he had no memory of ever meeting this woman before 30 seconds ago. "What? 3 weeks ago? Parking garage. You held the elevator door without being asked. Didn't try to make conversation. Didn't stare at me like I was prized to be won. You just stood there quietly, then nodded and disappeared." Cameron had vague memory of holding an elevator for someone in the parking garage, the kind of automatic politeness that became habit when you work service positions. But he'd never looked at the person's face, never registered that the moment had mattered enough to be remembered. "That kiss wasn't for the crowd." Her voice cracked. "It was for me. If I hadn't done something, anything, I would have frozen. Marcus would have seen me freeze, and he would have known I'm scared of him. I can't let him win. Not tonight." Cameron recognized the edge she was standing on. He'd stood there himself in the hospital corridor when doctors told him Rachel wasn't going to survive her injuries in the funeral home, when he had to choose casket for a woman who was 32 years old and shouldn't have needed one in the dark hours after Lily fell asleep, when grief suggested that perhaps continuing to exist required more strength than Cameron possessed. The woman was spiraling. He could see it breathing, getting faster, hands trembling harder, composure collapsing under weight she'd been carrying too long. Cameron had worked enough emergency response to recognize panic attack developing in whatever complicated situation he'd just been pulled into. Letting this woman have public breakdown seemed worse than whatever consequences would follow from helping her. He kept his voice calm, the tone that emergency responders use for people in crisis. "Hey, look at me." She did, eyes focusing on his face with effort that suggested she was fighting hard to stay present. "You're having a panic attack. That's normal given what just happened. But you're safe right now. The guy Marcus, he's still in the ballroom. You're here with me. Nobody's going to hurt you. You don't understand. This isn't just about tonight. He's been destroying everything I built for 6 months. And if he sees that I'm scared, if he knows he got to me..." 10 minutes. Cameron interrupted before she could spiral further. "Give yourself 10 minutes to breathe. Then you can go back out there and handle whatever you need to handle. But right now, just breathe." She stared at him like he'd spoken in foreign language, like the concept of taking 10 minutes for herself was so alien that she couldn't process it. "I don't have 10 minutes. Meridian Holdings executives are arriving, and I need to be there to make first impression before Marcus can poison the conversation. In 10 minutes, you can be composed and ready. Right now, you're about 5 seconds from completely falling apart. Which version is going to make better impression?" The logic penetrated. She took a breath that shuddered but stayed controlled. 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Then you go back out there and convince whoever needs convincing that you're exactly as competent as you actually are. Something flickered in her expression, surprise maybe, or recognition that this stranger in a maintenance uniform somehow understood what she needed to hear. She straightened shoulders, pulling back CEO, sliding back into place like the armor she'd temporarily removed. "What's your name?" "Cameron Brooks." "I'm Victoria Sterling." She extended her hand like they were at a business function instead of a service corridor where she'd just had a panic attack. "Thank you for helping and for not asking questions." Cameron shook her hand, noting the manicure that probably cost more than his weekly groceries and the strength in her grip that suggested someone who'd learned to project confidence through physical presence. Questions seemed like they'd just make this more complicated. "They would," Victoria managed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I need to ask you something and you're absolutely allowed to say no. Actually, you should probably say no because this is insane and inappropriate and I have no right to ask." Cameron had a feeling he knew where this was going, and every rational part of his brain was screaming that he should extract himself from this situation before it became whatever complicated mess Victoria was about to propose. But the part of him that had once been good at emergency response, that had learned to help people in crisis even when helping was complicated, couldn't quite walk away from someone who looked like they were drowning. 10 minutes. "You said you needed 10 minutes to decide how to handle Marcus. What happens after 10 minutes?" "After 10 minutes, I go back out there and face him. But if I'm alone, when I do that, he'll see it as weakness. He'll use tonight against me with the board, tell them I can't handle pressure, suggest that maybe I'm not stable enough to run Sterling Capital." She paused, and Cameron could see her calculating weighing risk versus reward with the speed that suggested she made complex decisions under pressure regularly. "But if I walk out there with someone, if Marcus sees that I'm not alone, that I've moved on, it changes the dynamic, takes away his leverage." "So you want me to stand next to you while you talk to these Meridian people?" "Yes, for the rest of tonight. Maybe the next few days until the contracts are signed and Marcus can't touch them." The request was insane. Cameron knew it was insane. He had Lily waiting at Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment, had delivery shifts tomorrow, had carefully balanced life that didn't include pretending to be someone's husband at business events where he clearly didn't belong. But he also knew what it felt like to face worse moments alone. Knew what it meant when someone said they needed help, even when asking for help cost them pride and control, and all the things that people like Victoria had learned to never show vulnerability about. "I'm a maintenance worker. I don't know anything about your world. I'm going to mess this up." Victoria's expression shifted to something that might have been hope trying to break through desperation. "You already saved me once tonight. When you called yourself..." She stopped processing what Cameron had just implied. "Wait, you'll do it." Cameron thought about Lily's question from last week. "Daddy, if someone needs help, are we supposed to help them?" He'd said yes because that was the answer parents were supposed to give their children, the principle that suggested the world worked better when people helped each other instead of walking away. Keep your money. The words came out before Cameron could reconsider them. If I do this, I'm not doing it for a paycheck. Then why would you do it? Because 3 years ago, a nurse had held his hand in the hospital and told him he didn't have to face the worst night alone. Because Lily asked questions about helping people, and Cameron wanted to tell her, yes, people did help when help was needed. Because this woman had looked at him like he was real person rather than invisible service worker, and that mattered more than it probably should. Because nobody should have to deal with this alone. Victoria's eyes went bright with tears. She blinked back before they could fall. Okay, okay, just stand next to me. Let Marcus see that I'm not frozen, that's all I need. They stepped back into the ballroom like actors taking the stage. Victoria's hand slid into the crook of Cameron's elbow, fingers digging in with pressure that communicated how much control she was exerting to appear casual. The crowd had mostly returned to their conversations, but heads still turned, whispers rippling through the room as wealthy people processed the image of Victoria Sterling with maintenance worker. Cameron could feel their assessment, the calculation happening behind polite faces as guests tried to determine who he was and why Victoria was touching him, and whether this was something that mattered or just odd moment that would be forgotten by morning. They crossed toward the windows where small group had gathered around older couple who radiated the kind of casual wealth that came from decades of success. Marcus stood on the periphery of this group, silver hair catching the chandelier light, eyes tracking Victoria's approach with predatory focus that made Cameron's protective instincts activate, despite having known this woman for less than 15 minutes. Up close, Marcus looked exactly like the kind of man Cameron had learned to distrust on instinct, too polished, too confident, smiling with mouth while eyes calculated. He watched Victoria approach with expression that cycled through surprise to confusion, to something darker, possessive anger to barely controlled beneath social conditioning. His voice was smooth when he spoke, carrying just enough volume that nearby guests could hear. Victoria, I didn't realize you'd be bringing a guest. Victoria's grip on Cameron's elbow tightened steel beneath silk. Marcus, I didn't realize you'd be here at all. The Meridian Holdings team invited me personally. They value my insights on Sterling Capital's strategic direction. The threat was casual, delivered with smile that didn't reach his eyes. How interesting that you're suddenly so concerned about my business relationships. Not sudden at all. Victoria's smile matched his for false warmth. I've always been concerned about people who try to undermine Sterling Capital, though I see your taste in passive-aggressive comments hasn't improved. Marcus's gaze slid to Cameron, assessment, dismissive and cruel simultaneously. Though I see your taste in companions hasn't improved either. Something shifted in Cameron, protective instinct overriding the trained invisibility that service workers learn to survive with. He extended his hand with confidence. He absolutely didn't feel aware that every person nearby was watching this interaction. Cameron Brooks, Victoria's husband. The word dropped into the conversation like stone into still water. Nearby guests went silent. The older couple who'd been talking with Marcus turned to stare. And Marcus's face went through expressions too fast to catalog: shock, disbelief, rage, forced control. Husband. Marcus repeated the word like it was a foreign concept he needed to process. That's interesting. I don't recall hearing about a wedding. That's right. Cameron glanced at Victoria, seeing her nod slightly. We've been married about a year now. Isn't that right, honey? Victoria's voice came out steady, despite the way her hand was trembling against his elbow. A year and 2 months. We had a small ceremony. Very private. How convenient. Marcus's voice hardened. How convenient that no one knew about this marriage. That you've never mentioned a husband to the board. That there are no records of a wedding license. We didn't see the need to make an announcement. Cameron kept his voice level, channeling every lesson he'd learned from emergency response about staying calm when people were actively hostile. Some things are worth keeping between the people who matter. The older couple, the Meridian Holdings executives, Cameron realized were staring openly, now expressions shifting from confusion to something that looked like approval. The woman actually smiled at Victoria, raising her champagne glass in small gesture of congratulation. It was working. Whatever desperate gambit Victoria had initiated, it was actually working because Marcus looked like someone had rearranged his chessboard without permission, and he couldn't quite figure out how to respond. Victoria's voice carried just enough warmth to sound genuine. If you'll excuse us, Marcus, we should say hello to Richard and Patricia from Meridian Holdings. They didn't make it to our ceremony, and we've been meaning to introduce Cameron properly. She guided Cameron away before Marcus could respond, leaving him standing there with expression that promised consequences, even if he couldn't deliver them immediately. They crossed the ballroom toward the older couple who were now watching their approach with interest rather than confusion. Richard was perhaps 65, distinguished in the way that successful men aged when they had money for personal trainers and expensive skincare. Patricia was similar age, wearing diamonds that caught the light and suggested decades of wealth rather than new acquisition. They both radiated the casual confidence of people who'd been important for so long that performance was unnecessary. Victoria's hand was still gripping Cameron's elbow, hard enough that he'd probably have bruises tomorrow, but her voice came out warm and professional as she made introductions. Richard, Patricia, I'd like you to meet my husband, Cameron Brooks. Cameron, Richard, and Patricia Chen from Meridian Holdings. Cameron shook hands and tried not to think about how these people could probably tell from his calluses exactly what kind of work he did for a living. Richard's grip was firm, assessing the handshake of someone who made judgments quickly. Patricia's hand was soft manicured, her smile genuine in ways that suggested she was actually pleased to meet him rather than just performing politeness. Patricia's voice carried genuine warmth. It's lovely to finally meet you, Cameron. Victoria has been keeping you quite the secret. We prefer to keep our personal lives private. Cameron kept his voice steady, aware that he was improvising without script, and that any moment he could say something that would expose the entire deception, especially given how public Victoria's professional life is. Richard nodded like this made perfect sense. Quite right. The business press can be invasive. Better to maintain some boundaries. He glanced at Victoria. Though I'm surprised Thomas never mentioned you had married. He and I play golf twice a month, and he's never brought it up. Victoria's hand tightened further on Cameron's elbow. My father and I have a complicated relationship regarding my personal life. He had expectations about who I should marry that didn't align with my choices. Patricia made sympathetic sound. Family expectations can be difficult to navigate, but ultimately you have to live your own life, not the one your parents designed for you. They talked for another 10 minutes, easy conversation about holidays and Chicago weather, and the logistics of Meridian Holdings' proposed partnership with Sterling Capital. Cameron said as little as possible, letting Victoria carry the conversation, while he stood beside her, projecting whatever version of supportive husband seemed appropriate for situations he'd never experienced and didn't understand. Marcus kept his distance through the rest of the evening, but Cameron could feel him watching, calculating, adjusting whatever strategy he'd had before encountering this new information, that Victoria was apparently married to a maintenance worker nobody knew existed. At 11:17 p.m., Victoria's composure finally fractured. Cameron felt it in the way her hand started shaking against his elbow and the way her breathing changed in the subtle shift from controlled performance to someone who'd been performing too long and was about to collapse. He leaned close enough that his voice wouldn't carry beyond her hearing. Service corridor. Now. She didn't argue, just let him guide her away from the ballroom with practiced ease that suggested she'd been waiting for permission to stop performing. The service corridor was blessedly empty, fluorescent lights buzzing with their characteristic frequency, while Victoria put her back against concrete wall and slid down until she was sitting on the floor. Cameron knelt beside her, aware that his maintenance uniform was now probably ruined from the concrete dust, but caring less about that than about the fact that Victoria was having full breakdown in service corridor wearing $4,000 dress. I can't believe I just did that. Her voice was hollow shock setting in as adrenaline faded. I kissed a stranger, lied to everyone, told Richard and Patricia that you're my husband when you're, she gestured vaguely at his uniform. When I'm what, a maintenance worker? Cameron kept his voice gentle because she was clearly spiraling. That's what I am. If that's a problem, you should have thought about it before you kissed me in front of 200 people. Victoria laughed, broken sound that was half sob. The worst part is, it worked. Did you see Marcus's face? He didn't expect it, couldn't process it. And Richard and Patricia actually seemed happy for me. Like marrying maintenance worker was somehow more respectable than whatever Marcus had been telling them about me. Cameron filled paper cup with water from the service corridor fountain, brought it back and pressed it into her hands. The weight seemed to ground her breathing, starting to slow as shock faded into exhaustion. What happens now? Cameron finally asked the question that had been building since Victoria kissed him. Marcus is going to investigate me. He's going to figure out I'm not actually your husband and then whatever you accomplish tonight falls apart. Victoria's laugh was bitter. Then I'll tell him it is none of his business, that my personal life is exactly that personal. That whether you and I are legally married or just together, it doesn't change anything about my competence to run Sterling Capital. Except he'll use it against you. Tell the board you're lying to investors. Use tonight as proof that you're unstable. Probably, Victoria took a shaky breath, which is why I need to ask you for more than 10 minutes. Cameron had known this was coming, but hearing it still made his stomach drop. How much more? The Meridian Holdings partnership is contingent on board approval. My board is split between members who trust me and members who think Marcus might be right about my judgment. If I walk back into Sterling Capital on Monday alone, if they see that Marcus rattled me tonight, they'll start second-guessing everything. She looked up at Cameron with eyes that showed exactly how much it cost her to ask for help. But if you walk in there with me, if they see that I'm stable, that I've moved on from Marcus, that I have support system, it changes the narrative. Makes me the woman who recovered from bad engagement instead of the unstable CEO who can't handle pressure. You're asking me to keep pretending to be your husband. Yes, not forever, just until the Meridian contracts are signed. 2 weeks, maybe 3. After that, you can go back to your life and I'll go back to mine and we'll have helped each other through temporary crisis. Cameron thought about Lily waiting at Mrs. Rodriguez's, thought about his 3 jobs and his carefully balanced life and all the sensible reasons to say no to what Victoria was proposing. Then he thought about the way she'd looked when she buckled in this corridor earlier, about the terror in her eyes, when she'd seen Marcus, about the fact that she was fighting battle alone against someone who was systematically destroying everything she'd built. I have a 4-year-old daughter. I work 3 jobs. My life is complicated in ways that don't fit into your world. I know. And I'm not asking you to change your life. I'm asking you to let me into it temporarily. We can figure out logistics. I'll make sure Lily's comfortable. Whatever you need. What I need is for my life to make sense again. Cameron heard the exhaustion in his own voice. But that ship sailed the moment you kissed me. Victoria's expression shifted to something that might have been hope. Is that a yes? Cameron thought about Lily's question, about helping people, about the nurse who'd held his hand 3 years ago, about all the small moments when someone had helped him survive the worst and how maybe now he could be that person for someone else. 2 weeks, until your contracts are signed. Then we figure out how to end this without destroying whatever you've accomplished. Thank you. Victoria's voice cracked. Thank you, Cameron. I know this is insane. I know I have no right to ask, but thank you. They sat in the service corridor while the gala continued without them. 2 people who'd met an hour ago and who'd just agreed to construct an elaborate lie that would either save Victoria's company or destroy what remained of Cameron's carefully rebuilt life. Marcus appeared at the far end of the corridor, apparently having come looking for them. He stopped when he saw them sitting together, Cameron's hand resting on Victoria's shoulder in gesture that could be read as supportive or intimate, depending on what the observer wanted to see. His voice carried down the hallway, cold and controlled. Victoria, we need to talk. Cameron stood, positioning himself between Marcus and Victoria in movement that was protective without being aggressive. I think my wife has made it clear she's done talking to you for tonight. This doesn't concern you. Everything that concerns my wife concerns me. Marcus's face went through expressions he was clearly trying to control. You have no idea what you've walked into. This woman is manipulating you, using you. And when she's done, she'll discard you like everything else she doesn't need anymore. Victoria stood, composure rebuilt enough that she could face Marcus directly. That's rich coming from a man who spent our engagement positioning himself to take over my company. Go home, Marcus. You've done enough damage for one night. This isn't over. Yes, it is. It's been over since I called off our wedding 8 months ago. You just haven't accepted it yet. Marcus looked between them, calculating clearly, recognizing that whatever strategy he'd planned for tonight had failed spectacularly. We'll see what the board thinks about your new husband. I'm sure they'll have questions about when this marriage happened and why nobody knew about it. Let them ask. Unlike you, I don't owe the board explanations about my personal life. Marcus walked away without responding, leaving Cameron and Victoria standing in the service corridor while consequences they'd initiated started manifesting in ways neither of them could predict. Victoria turned to Cameron, and for the first time since kissing him in front of 200 people, she smiled with something approaching genuine warmth. You just called me your wife to Marcus's face. You started it by kissing me. I figured I'd commit to the bit. Well, you're very good at committing. Most people would have run away screaming by now. Most people didn't spend 3 years learning that running away from hard situations doesn't make them less hard. Victoria studied him with expression that suggested she was seeing him properly for the first time, rather than just desperate strangers she'd recruited for elaborate deception. You're not what I expected when I grabbed you tonight. What did you expect? Someone who'd say yes to the money I offered. Someone who'd treat this like transaction. Someone who wouldn't understand why I'm fighting so hard to keep something Marcus is trying to take. And instead, you got maintenance worker with dead wife and 4-year-old daughter who said yes because people should help when they can. Yeah, Victoria's voice went soft. Instead, I got you. They stood there for a moment, strangers who'd become conspirators, who'd now become something else neither of them had name for yet. The gala was winding down, guests starting to leave, servers beginning the cleanup that would take hours. Cameron's phone buzzed with text from Mrs. Rodriguez asking if he was okay and when he'd be home. He responded quickly, emergency at work, probably after midnight. Thank you for watching, Lily. Then turned back to Victoria, who was watching him with expression that mixed gratitude and guilt. I should let you go home to your daughter. You should. But first we need to figure out what happens Monday when I'm supposed to show up at Sterling Capital with husband nobody knew I had. We'll figure it out. Victoria's confidence was returning, CEO sliding back into place now that immediate crisis had passed. I'll have my lawyer draft a brief statement. We'll say we got married a year ago, kept it private, and we're asking for respect of our privacy. Simple. Straightforward. Impossible to disprove without invading personal records. Except Marcus is going to investigate me. He's going to find out I work 3 jobs and live in a 2-bedroom apartment and have more debt than most people earn in 5 years. So, Victoria's voice carried challenge. Is there something shameful about working 3 jobs, about providing for your daughter, about doing whatever it takes to survive? No, but there's a difference between me thinking there's nothing shameful about it and your board members thinking the same thing. Victoria's expression hardened. If my board members judge you for being working class, that says more about them than it does about you. And if they judge me for marrying you, then they clearly don't understand that character matters more than bank accounts. Cameron wanted to believe her confidence was justified, but years of being invisible to wealthy people suggested otherwise. We'll see. Monday's going to be interesting either way. Monday's going to be a disaster, but we'll face it together. The word together landed with more weight than it should have, given that they'd met 90 minutes ago and had agreed to elaborate deception that would probably explode spectacularly. But something in the way Victoria said it, the way her hand reached out to squeeze his arm briefly before letting go, suggested that maybe this temporary alliance was already becoming something more complicated than either of them had intended. Cameron left the Regency Crown at 12:47 a.m. exhaustion, making the world feel slightly unreal. The overnight maintenance shift he'd been covering was technically over, which meant he'd just earned $216 for the strangest 8 hours of his life. He'd started the evening as invisible service worker, keeping infrastructure functional. He'd ended it as Victoria Sterling's fake husband, having lied to Chicago's business elite and somehow gotten away with it. The train ride home was empty, just Cameron and a handful of other overnight workers heading to wherever home was at 1 in the morning. He stared at his reflection in the dark window and tried to process what he'd just agreed to. 2 weeks of pretending to be married to billionaire CEO who was being systematically destroyed by ex-fiancé with obvious control issues. 2 weeks of lying to people who could make or break Victoria's career with single board vote. 2 weeks of hoping that Marcus wouldn't dig too deep into Cameron's background and discover the kind of financial instability that would make Victoria's judgment look questionable. His phone buzzed with text from Victoria. "Thank you again for tonight. My lawyer will call you tomorrow morning to discuss details." And Cameron, I meant what I said. I'll make sure Lily's comfortable with whatever arrangement we figure out. This is temporary crisis management, not permanent disruption of your life. Cameron typed back, "Just make sure your lawyer calls after 8 a.m. Lily wakes up early, and I don't want to explain Daddy's new fake wife before she's had breakfast." Victoria's response came immediately. "Noted. And for what it's worth, you're good at this. The husband performance, I mean. Very convincing. Years of practice pretending I'm holding it together. Turns out the skills transfer." That's depressingly relatable. "Get some sleep, Cameron. Tomorrow's going to be complicated." Cameron arrived at his apartment at 1:34 a.m. to find Mrs. Rodriguez asleep in his armchair, knitting project in her lap, television playing some telenovela on low volume. He woke her, gently apologized for keeping her so late, tried to pay her $50 from the night's earnings. She waved away the money with expression that suggested he'd insulted her by offering, "Mijo, you don't pay family. Lily's fine. She went to bed at 8, no nightmares tonight. Now go sleep before you collapse." "Mrs. Rodriguez, I need to tell you something." She studied his face with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You look like someone who just made a decision that's either brilliant or catastrophic and won't know which for several days." "What did you do?" "I agreed to help someone who needed help, but it's complicated, and it's going to involve some changes to my schedule for the next few weeks." "Changes like what?" "Changes like I might need you to watch Lily more often. Changes like there might be people asking questions about me and my life. Changes like—" He paused, trying to figure out how to explain without revealing details he hadn't fully processed himself. "I'm helping someone with a situation. That's all I can say right now, but it's temporary. And I promise Lily won't be affected." Mrs. Rodriguez stood, gathering her knitting expression, shifting from curious to concerned. "Cameron, you're a good man. Too good sometimes. Just make sure this person you're helping isn't taking advantage of that goodness." "She's not. At least I don't think she is. She's desperate, and I was available, and sometimes that's how life works. Sometimes desperation makes people do things they regret. Just be careful, mijo." She left, and Cameron stood in his quiet apartment, feeling the weight of what he'd agreed to settling onto shoulders that were already carrying too much. He checked on Lily, found her sleeping peacefully, clutching her elephant, blonde hair spread across pillow, small face peaceful in ways that suggested she hadn't registered her father's absence. Cameron stood in Lily's doorway, watching her breathe, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something that wasn't just exhaustion and grief and the grinding pressure of survival. He felt purpose, not the purpose that came from working 3 jobs and keeping Lily fed and housed, but the purpose that came from helping someone who needed help, from using the skills he'd developed during years of emergency response to make a difference for someone who was drowning. It probably was insane. It probably would end badly, but Cameron had stopped believing in good endings 3 years ago when Rachel died, and if he was going to make catastrophic decisions, at least this one involved helping someone instead of just surviving another day. He went to bed at 2:16 a.m. with his phone on the nightstand, showing 17 unread texts from Victoria's lawyer, introducing himself and requesting meeting to discuss legal strategy for their fake marriage. Cameron ignored them all and fell asleep, thinking about the way Victoria had looked when she'd said together, like maybe she'd been alone fighting battles for so long that having ally, even temporary, even fake, meant more than she could articulate. Tomorrow would be complicated. But tonight, Cameron had helped someone who needed help, and that had to count for something, even if everything else that followed turned out to be disaster. Cameron woke to 17 missed calls and his phone vibrating with notifications that had been accumulating since 6:23 a.m. The alarm clock showed 7:04, which meant he had overslept by an hour and 21 minutes, which meant Lily was probably awake and wondering where breakfast was, which meant Mrs. Rodriguez had probably let herself in using the spare key and was currently managing a morning routine that should have been Cameron's responsibility. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through the notification avalanche. Text from Kevin at the Regency Crown asking if Cameron had seen the news. 3 voicemails from numbers he didn't recognize. Email from Victoria's lawyer with subject line, "Urgent Media Response Strategy." and a news alert from Chicago Tribune with headline that made Cameron's stomach drop into his feet. Sterling Capital CEO's mystery husband revealed at charity gala. Below the headline was a photograph taken from last night. Cameron in his maintenance uniform, Victoria in her $4,000 dress the moment right after she kissed him in front of 200 witnesses. The image captured Victoria's hand on his collar, his expression of complete confusion, and the background crowd frozen in various states of shock. The article was speculation disguised as journalism, filled with phrases like unconfirmed reports and sources close to Sterling Capital, and questions remain about the timeline. But the core narrative was clear. Victoria Sterling had apparently been secretly married for over a year to a man nobody in Chicago's business community had ever heard of, and the revelation had happened at last night's Christmas gala in front of investors who were currently evaluating a $2 billion partnership. Cameron's phone rang. Unknown number, Chicago area code. He answered before thinking better of it. Victoria's voice came through tight with controlled panic. Have you seen it? Just woke up to 17 alerts. So yes, my PR team is drafting a statement, but they need information from you. Work history, education, anything that makes you look like reasonable choice for CEO to marry instead of random maintenance worker I picked up at a hotel. Cameron walked to his kitchen, where Mrs. Rodriguez had indeed let herself in and was currently making pancakes while Lily sat at the table drawing pictures of what appeared to be castles. His daughter looked up and waved, and Cameron waved back while trying to figure out how to explain to a 4-year-old that Daddy had accidentally become fake husband to a billionaire overnight. Victoria, I am a random maintenance worker. There's no PR spin that changes that reality. Then we emphasize the human interest angle. You're a single father working 3 jobs to provide for your daughter. That's sympathetic. That's the kind of story that makes people root for you instead of judging me for marrying outside my economic class. The phrase marrying outside my economic class landed wrong, carrying implications about how Victoria's world viewed people like Cameron. He pushed down the irritation because she was panicking, and panic made people say things they didn't mean. What do you need from me? My lawyer, Jennifer Chen, is coming to your apartment in 45 minutes. She'll need to interview you, go over our story, prepare you for questions that media and board members will ask. Victoria paused. Is that okay? I know this is moving fast, but we need to get ahead of this before Marcus can weaponize it. Cameron glanced at Lily, who was now drawing stick figures that might have been people or might have been aliens, hard to tell with 4-year-old art. Mrs. Rodriguez was watching him with expression that said she'd been listening to the entire conversation and had questions that Cameron wasn't ready to answer. 45 minutes. My address is in the employee files at the Regency Crown. Tell your lawyer not to look too shocked by the neighborhood. Cameron, Victoria's voice went softer. I'm sorry. I'm sorry this exploded faster than we expected. I'm sorry you're being pulled into media circus. I'm sorry for all of it. Save the apology for when this is over and we can evaluate whether it was worth it. He hung up and turned to find Mrs. Rodriguez standing with spatula in hand, expression mixing concern with a barely suppressed curiosity. Lily was oblivious, humming while she drew, but Mrs. Rodriguez had clearly heard enough to know something significant had happened. Her voice carried the gentle sternness that had probably terrified generations of elementary school students. Mijo, you want to tell me why a lawyer is coming here in 45 minutes? Cameron sat down at the table, accepting the coffee Mrs. Rodriguez poured without being asked. Remember yesterday when I said I was helping someone and it was complicated? I remember. It got more complicated, and I can't explain all of it. But for the next few weeks, people might be asking questions about me and Lily, about where we live, how much I make, what kind of father I am. He paused, trying to find words for a situation that had no precedent in his experience. I need you to just not be surprised by anything you hear, and know that none of it changes anything real about our lives. Mrs. Rodriguez studied him with a sharp assessment that missed nothing. This woman you're helping, is she the blonde from the newspaper photo? You saw the photo. Everyone saw the photo, mijo. It's on 3 different news sites and your face is very clear. She set down her spatula and crossed her arms. So yes, I saw the photo of you kissing some rich woman in evening gown while wearing your work uniform. And now her lawyer is coming here. which means whatever you agreed to last night is bigger than helping someone with a situation. Cameron had never been able to lie to Mrs. Rodriguez. She had some kind of radar for dishonesty that had probably saved her life teaching middle school for 40 years. He made decision to give her partial truth because complete truth would require explanations he didn't have time for. Her name is Victoria Sterling. She runs a company. Her ex-fiancé has been stalking her and trying to destroy her career. Last night she panicked when she saw him and she asked me to pretend to be her husband, to make him think she'd moved on. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyebrows went up. And you said yes to this insanity? I said yes because she looked like I felt 3 years ago in that hospital. Like she was drowning and needed someone to throw her a line, even if the person throwing it didn't know how to swim either. Ay, mijo. Mrs. Rodriguez's expression softened. Your heart is too big for your common sense. This woman is going to complicate your life in ways you haven't thought through. Probably, but I already said yes, and now there are photos and articles, and I can't exactly call the newspaper and tell them it was all a misunderstanding. Lily looked up from her drawing, registering the seriousness in the adults' voices, even if she didn't understand the content. Daddy, who's coming to our house? Cameron knelt beside her, chair eye level, the way he'd learned to do when delivering information that needed to land gently. A lady named Jennifer is coming to ask me some questions. She's very nice, but she's going to be here for a little while. Can you keep drawing your pictures and being patient while Daddy talks with her? What kind of questions? Grown-up questions about boring grown-up things. Nothing you need to worry about. Lily accepted this with the trust that 4-year-olds showed when their parents promised everything was fine. She returned to her drawing while Cameron tried to prepare himself for interview that would determine whether Victoria's desperate gambit from last night could survive contact with morning after reality. Jennifer Chen arrived at exactly 8:47 a.m., which meant she'd probably been waiting in her car for 3 minutes to achieve precise punctuality. She was mid-40s Chinese-American, wearing suit that probably cost more than Cameron's monthly rent, carrying leather briefcase that looked like it had survived decades of legal battles. She shook Cameron's hand with grip that was professionally firm without being aggressive. Mr. Brooks, thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice. I know this situation has escalated quickly. Cameron showed her to the kitchen table, the only space in his apartment suitable for conversations that required sitting. Lily had moved to the living room with Mrs. Rodriguez, both of them pretending to watch cartoons, while clearly trying to eavesdrop on whatever was about to be discussed. Jennifer set her briefcase on the table and pulled out tablet and stack of documents that suggested this interview would be thorough. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. Some will feel invasive. All of them are necessary because if we're going to construct a believable narrative, I need to know the truth first so I can figure out what parts we emphasize and what parts we contextualize. Contextualize, that's a nice word for lying. We're not lying, Mr. Brooks. We're strategically presenting facts in ways that support the narrative Victoria needs to maintain. Jennifer's voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone who'd made a career out of helping wealthy people manage truth. Now, Victoria said you met approximately a year ago. Is that accurate? No, I met her last night when she grabbed my collar and kissed me in front of 200 people. Jennifer didn't even blink. But you had encountered her previously. In the parking garage 3 weeks ago, Victoria mentioned that you held an elevator door. I hold elevator doors for lots of people. It's called basic courtesy. Good. So we can say you first encountered each other 3 weeks ago, had several subsequent interactions, developed connection that led to relationship. Jennifer typed something on her tablet. When would you say the relationship became serious? Cameron stared at her. There is no relationship. This is elaborate fiction Victoria created because she was panicking about her stalker ex-fiancé. Mr. Brooks, I understand you're trying to be honest, but honesty in this situation is liability. Jennifer set down her tablet and looked at him directly. Here's the reality that photograph is on every business news site in Chicago. Marcus Ashford is currently calling board members telling them Victoria has been lying about her personal life. If we don't construct believable timeline, the board will question her judgment and the Meridian Holdings partnership will collapse. Which means we need you to commit to this narrative completely, or we need to end this arrangement now before more damage is done. Cameron thought about Victoria's face last night. when she'd buckled in the service corridor. Thought about the terror in her eyes when she'd seen Marcus. Thought about how he'd already said yes, and backing out now would leave her worse off than if he'd never agreed in the first place. "What do you need me to say?" Relief flickered across Jennifer's professional composure. "Tell me about your work history, education, family background, anything that explains who you are beyond maintenance worker at a luxury hotel." For the next 40 minutes, Cameron walked Jennifer through his life in clinical detail. High school graduation, but no college because Rachel got pregnant senior year, and they decided to get married instead of pursuing degrees they couldn't afford. Emergency response training through community program because Cameron had been good in crisis situations and the program was free if you committed to volunteer work. 5 years on a rescue team before Rachel died and Cameron quit because he couldn't handle the pressure anymore. 3 jobs now, 42,000 a year gross, 180,000 in debt from medical bills and funeral costs. 2-bedroom apartment in working class neighborhood. Lily in state subsidized preschool. Mrs. Rodriguez as unpaid childcare because professional daycare cost more than Cameron could afford. Jennifer typed everything without judgment, professional mask, never slipping, though Cameron could see her calculating how to spin working class struggle into sympathetic narrative instead of liability. "The rescue team training is good. We can emphasize that you have emergency response background, makes you sound more capable than just maintenance worker." Jennifer scrolled through her notes. "The dead wife is sympathetic, but we need to be careful not to make it sound like Victoria is rebound. How long ago did she die?" 3 years, and her name was Rachel, not the dead wife." "Of course, I apologize." Jennifer's voice softened marginally. 3 years is appropriate grieving period before remarriage. We can work with that timeline. They spent another hour constructing the relationship narrative. Cameron and Victoria had met professionally. He'd been doing maintenance work at a conference where she was speaking. They'd encountered each other multiple times over subsequent months, had started talking, discovered unexpected connection despite economic differences. Relationship developed slowly, carefully, neither of them rushing into anything given Cameron's loss and Victoria's complicated professional situation. They'd gotten married at courthouse 11 months ago. Small ceremony, just immediate family because Victoria wanted to keep it private after the disaster with Marcus. Cameron had been supportive of her career, understanding that being CEO of major company required discretion about personal life. They'd maintained separate residences initially because Lily needed stability and Victoria traveled frequently, but they spent time together when schedules allowed. It was believable because it hid enough truth to avoid being completely fabricated, and it was flexible enough that they could adjust details as needed when inevitable questions arose. Jennifer closed her tablet at 10:34 a.m. and looked at Cameron with expression that was almost sympathetic. "You're very good at this. Most people struggle to maintain consistent narrative under pressure, but you answered every question without hesitation." "I spent 3 years learning to lie about being okay when I wasn't. Turns out the skills transfer." Victoria said something similar last night. Jennifer packed her briefcase with practiced efficiency. "She said you understood what it meant to perform stability while drowning inside." Cameron didn't respond because there was nothing to say that wouldn't reveal more vulnerability than he wanted this lawyer to see. Instead, he asked the question that had been building since she arrived. "What happens now?" "Now we prepare for Marcus to attack. He will absolutely investigate you. Your employment history, your finances, your late wife, everything. He'll look for anything he can use to make Victoria's judgment look questionable." Jennifer paused. "But based on what you've told me, the worst he'll find is that you're a working class man dealing with tragic loss while raising daughter alone. And frankly, that narrative makes Victoria look more human rather than less competent. Unless the board thinks she's so desperate for connection that she married the first person who showed her kindness, then we emphasize that you pursued her, that you're the one who initiated a relationship because you saw past the CEO to the woman underneath." Jennifer stood, preparing to leave. "Mr. Brooks, I know this seems insane, but Victoria wouldn't have asked for your help if she wasn't truly desperate. Marcus has been systematically destroying her for 6 months. She needs this partnership to succeed, or she loses everything her father spent 37 years building." After Jennifer left, Cameron sat at his kitchen table, staring at the documents she'd left behind, bullet points of their fake relationship timeline, of significant moments that never happened. Photograph of him and Victoria from last night with caption that read, "Love finds a way, Sterling CEO's surprise marriage." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with coffee that Cameron hadn't asked for but desperately needed. She sat down across from him, no judgment in her expression, just the concerned kindness of someone who'd been watching him survive for 2 years and who recognized when he was in over his head. This is going to change everything you know. Your quiet life, your careful invisibility. Once people know who you are, you can't go back to being anonymous maintenance worker. I know. And this woman, Victoria, she's asking you to risk a lot for her. What's she risking for you? Cameron hadn't thought about it that way. Victoria had recruited him for a role that served her needs, promised to make sure Lily was comfortable, offered to compensate him, though he'd refused. But Mrs. Rodriguez was right. Victoria wasn't actually risking anything because if this arrangement collapsed, she'd just return to being CEO with complicated personal life. Cameron would be the one whose face was in newspapers, whose daughter's privacy had been violated, whose life had been permanently altered by helping someone who might not even remember his name 6 months from now. I already said yes, so either I commit completely or I back out now and leave her worse off than when we started. Sometimes the brave thing isn't helping. Sometimes it's recognizing when you're being used and walking away before you get hurt. And sometimes people are drowning and you're the only one close enough to throw them a line. And maybe you both drown, but at least you tried. Mrs. Rodriguez sighed, the sound carrying decades of watching students make choices that would shape their futures in ways they couldn't predict. Just promise me you'll protect Lily first, before you protect this stranger who kissed you at a party. Lily's always first, that's not negotiable. But even as Cameron said it, he wondered how he'd protect Lily from media attention that was already spinning their lives into narrative neither of them controlled. The photograph from last night showed Cameron's face clearly. Any competent journalist could find his address, his employment records, his daughter's preschool. Privacy was already gone. The only question was whether what they gained from this arrangement would be worth what they lost. The media explosion accelerated through the weekend. By Saturday morning, Cameron's story had spread beyond Chicago business publications into national news sites that loved narratives about class-crossing romance. The headlines got progressively more absurd. Cinderella story in reverse, billionaire, CEO marries maintenance worker. Love knows no tax bracket, Sterling Capital's secret wedding. From service elevator to boardroom. How one man won Chicago's ice queen. Cameron's phone filled with a request for interviews. Good Morning America wanted them on Monday. People magazine offered 5 figures for exclusive wedding photos that didn't exist. TMZ camped outside his apartment building until building security threatened to call police. Victoria called Saturday afternoon, voice tight with stress that was trying to sound like control. Pack a bag. You and Lily are moving into my place until this dies down. We're not moving anywhere. This is temporary crisis management, remember? We maintain separate lives and just appear together when necessary. That was the plan before TMZ started harassing your neighbors and before someone leaked Lily's preschool location to gossip sites. Victoria's voice hardened. Cameron there are photographers outside Lily's school. They're taking pictures of 4-year-olds hoping to identify which one is your daughter. That's not acceptable. Cameron's protective instincts activated immediately. He'd been monitoring the situation carefully, keeping Lily inside, asking Mrs. Rodriguez to shield her from windows. But he hadn't considered that reporters would target the preschool directly. How did they find her school? Public records. Enrollment information that's technically protected, but which anyone with moderate research skills can access if they know where to look. Victoria paused. My building has security, controlled access, underground parking. Lily will be safer here than at your apartment, where any reporter with $20 can bribe the front desk clerk. You're asking me to move my daughter into your penthouse, a stranger's home, after knowing you for 48 hours. I'm asking you to let me protect the child of the man I supposedly married, because if reporters get photographs of Lily crying because strangers are following her, the sympathy narrative we're building falls apart, and you become the father who exposed his daughter to media circus for money. Cameron wanted to argue, but Victoria's logic was unassailable. He'd already pulled Lily from preschool Friday after the first photographer showed up. Mrs. Rodriguez was fielding calls from neighbors who wanted to know if Cameron really was married to Victoria Sterling. And every time Cameron looked out his window, there were 2 or 3 people with cameras waiting to capture images of the maintenance worker who'd somehow married into Chicago's business elite. 1 week. We try it for 1 week, and if Lily's uncomfortable or if this arrangement doesn't work, we figure out something else. Agreed. Pack clothes for both of you. I'll send a car at 6 p.m. The car that arrived at 6:04 p.m. was a black Lincoln Navigator with tinted windows and a driver who introduced himself as Marcus. Not that Marcus, a different one who'd been driving for Sterling Capital executives for 15 years. He loaded their bags with professional efficiency, his expression carefully neutral about the fact that he was transporting maintenance worker and 4-year-old to his employer's penthouse. Lily was fascinated by the car, chattering about the leather seats and the bottled water and the television screen embedded in the seatback. Cameron watched his daughter's excitement and felt a complicated mix of pride and anxiety. This kind of luxury was a temporary gift that would make returning to their normal life even harder when this arrangement ended. Victoria's building occupied the top 15 floors of a tower overlooking Lake Michigan, the kind of address that appeared in magazines about architectural achievement and urban luxury. The lobby was marble and glass and abstract art installations that probably cost more than Cameron's car. The elevator required keycard access and played jazz music that Cameron assumed was meant to be sophisticated. Victoria's penthouse was floor 41, entire floor that made Cameron's 2-bedroom apartment feel like closet. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the city and lake, open floor plan with kitchen that featured appliances Cameron didn't recognize, furniture that looked uncomfortable and expensive simultaneously. Victoria met them at the elevator wearing jeans and sweater that probably cost what Cameron earned in a week, but which made her look younger and more approachable than the CEO he'd met at the gala. She'd tied her hair back, no makeup, face showing exhaustion that professional styling had hidden 2 nights ago. She knelt down immediately when she saw Lily, eye level, voice gentle. "Hi, you must be Lily. I'm Victoria." Lily ducked behind Cameron's legs, suddenly shy in ways she sometimes was with strangers. Cameron rested his hand on her shoulder, reassuring presence. "It's okay, Lilybug. Victoria's a friend who's letting us stay here for a little while. Why can't we stay at our home?" The question was reasonable, and Cameron didn't have age-appropriate answer. "How did you explain to a 4-year-old that reporters were stalking you because Daddy had agreed to pretend to be someone's husband? How did you frame media harassment in ways that didn't terrify a child who was already anxious about people leaving?" Unexpectedly, Victoria spoke before Cameron could formulate response. "Because our home has better toys. And also because I have a very big bathtub with jets that make bubbles, and I thought maybe you'd like to try it." Lily's eyes went wide. "Bubbles? So many bubbles. Also, I have a room that I thought could be yours while you're staying here. Would you like to see it?" Lily looked up at Cameron for permission. He nodded and watched his daughter take Victoria's hand with tentative trust that made his chest ache. They'd practiced stranger danger extensively, but somehow Victoria had bypassed Lily's usual caution with simple kindness and promise of bubble baths. Victoria led them down the hallway to a room that had been transformed in the 48 hours since Cameron had agreed to this arrangement. The walls were painted soft purple, Lily's favorite color, which Victoria had somehow known. There was a bed, size for children's dresser, with drawers already labeled Lily's clothes, bookshelf filled with picture books, and a toy chest that was currently empty, but which Victoria was clearly expecting to fill. "I wasn't sure what toys you liked, so I thought we could go shopping tomorrow and you could pick." Victoria's voice carried genuine nervousness, like she was worried Lily wouldn't approve. "But for tonight, I thought maybe we could read some books before bed, if that's okay with your dad." Lily was already pulling books from the shelf, examining covers with the careful attention she gave to important decisions. Cameron stood in the doorway, feeling overwhelmed by how much effort Victoria had invested in making his daughter comfortable in space that was temporary fiction they were constructing together. Victoria appeared beside him, voice low enough that Lily couldn't hear. "Too much. It's perfect," which somehow makes this whole situation more complicated. "Welcome to my life for the past 6 months. Everything Marcus does is perfect on the surface while being manipulative underneath. I'm just trying to be actually perfect instead of performatively perfect." Cameron turned to look at her properly, seeing exhaustion she was fighting through, pharmaceutical-grade coffee and determination. When was the last time you slept? Properly about 6 months ago before Marcus started his campaign. Victoria managed tired smile. But I'll sleep when the Meridian contracts are signed and my company is secure. Until then, I function. That's not sustainable. Neither is working 3 jobs to survive, but here we both are functioning despite sustainability concerns. She had a point. They stood in the doorway watching Lily arrange books in order of preference, and Cameron realized that whatever had started as desperate deception 2 nights ago was already becoming something more complicated than either of them had intended. Living with Victoria Sterling turned out to be exercise in contradictions that Cameron couldn't quite reconcile. The penthouse was Museum of Wealth original artwork on walls, furniture arranged by professionals who understood negative space kitchen with appliances that probably required engineering degrees to operate. But Victoria herself moved through these spaces like someone who'd forgotten to feel at home, eating takeout at the counter, because the formal dining room felt too empty, working from the couch because her home office reminded her of meetings she'd rather avoid. Lily adapted faster than Cameron expected. 4-year-old resilience making luxury feel normal within days. She loved the bathtub with jets the view of the lake from her purple bedroom, the way Victoria would sit on the floor and build block towers without checking her phone every 30 seconds. On their third night, Lily asked the question Cameron had been dreading. Is Miss Victoria going to be my new mommy? They were sitting at the breakfast counter. Victoria had insisted on calling it breakfast, even though they were eating dinner because the formal dining table felt performative, and the question landed in the middle of conversation about what movies Lily liked. Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth, expression carefully neutral in ways that suggested she was monitoring Cameron's reaction before formulating her own. Cameron set down his water glass and chose honesty, because lying to Lily about important things never worked. Miss Victoria and I are friends helping each other right now. We're not, he searched for age-appropriate phrasing. We're not making permanent plans yet. We're just figuring things out day by day. Lily absorbed this with the seriousness she brought to important topics. But you like her, right? You smile different when she's here. The observation was accurate and uncomfortable. Cameron had noticed it himself, the way tension he'd been carrying for 3 years eased slightly when Victoria was present, like having ally in survival made survival feel less impossible. But acknowledging that felt dangerous when their arrangement was supposed to be temporary fiction. Victoria spoke before Cameron could deflect. I like your dad too, Lily. He's one of the kindest people I've ever met. But being kind to each other doesn't automatically mean we're going to get married for real. Sometimes people are just good friends who help each other through hard times. Daddy said Mommy was his best friend before she became my mommy. Lily's voice went quieter. Do you think Mommy would be tired if Daddy had a new best friend? Cameron felt his throat close. Rachel had been dead for 3 years, but Lily still processed her absence in waves, moments of clarity about death mixing with childhood magical thinking that maybe if Lily was good enough, Mommy might come back. I think Mommy would want Daddy to have friends who make him smile. And I think she'd like Miss Victoria because Miss Victoria is kind to you, and Mommy always said that people who are kind to kids are the best kind of people. Lily nodded, satisfied with this logic, and returned to her dinner while Cameron and Victoria exchanged glances that communicated volumes neither of them was ready to voice. They were crossing boundaries faster than intended, constructing emotional intimacy alongside the fake marriage narrative, and neither of them knew how to slow down without hurting the other. The attack came Monday morning in form of leaked documents that appeared on Chicago Business Journal's website at 6:47 a.m. Cameron woke to Victoria standing in his bedroom doorway, his temporary bedroom, the guest room that had somehow become his space, holding her tablet with expression that mixed fury and resignation. Marcus struck, employment records, financial history, everything. It's all public now. Cameron sat up in exhaustion, making cognition difficult. How bad? Read it yourself. The article was titled, Sterling CEO's Husband, Financial Instability Raises Questions About Judgment. Below the headline was everything Cameron had told Jennifer Chen during their interview, but twisted into narrative that made him sound like opportunist rather than survivor. 3 jobs framed as inability to hold steady employment. Medical debt presented as financial irresponsibility. Rachel's death mentioned but minimized life insurance payout characterized as windfall that Cameron had somehow squandered. Photographs accompanied the article Cameron's apartment building that looked worse in professional photography than it did in person. His rusted truck in the parking lot, his maintenance uniform from the Regency Crown. The implication was clear. Victoria Sterling had married someone so financially unstable that questions about her judgment were not just reasonable but mandatory. The comments section was predictably vicious. People questioning Cameron's motives, suggesting he'd targeted Victoria, deliberately speculating about prenuptial agreements, and whether Sterling Capital's board should intervene to protect shareholders from CEO's questionable personal decisions. Cameron read through the article twice, watching his life get dissected and reassembled into a weapon designed to destroy Victoria's credibility. The worst part was that technically everything in the article was accurate. He did work 3 jobs. He did have massive debt. He did live in a 2-bedroom apartment that cost $800 a month. The facts were correct, only the framing was malicious. Victoria was pacing, energy contained but barely. Jennifer's drafting a response, but she says anything we say will just draw more attention. Marcus is betting that the best strategy is letting this narrative solidify before we can counter it. So what do? We fight back. You give an interview, tell your side of the story before Marcus can define it for you. Cameron thought about what Jennifer had said, that the worst Marcus would find was working-class struggle and tragic loss. But seeing it weaponized in print made the vulnerability feel different, more exposed than Cameron had anticipated. What kind of interview? Local news. Someone sympathetic who will ask questions that let you explain rather than defend. We frame this as class, prejudice, business elite, uncomfortable with CEO marrying outside her economic bracket. Make the story about them judging you rather than about you being opportunist. It was smart strategy, and Cameron hated how calculating it sounded. But Victoria was right. Silence would let Marcus's narrative win, and winning meant destroying any credibility Cameron had while simultaneously making Victoria look like fool who'd been manipulated by someone she should have recognized as gold digger. The interview was scheduled for that afternoon. Local NBC affiliate that did human interest pieces alongside news coverage. The reporter was a woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to Jennifer, despite the shared surname, who'd built career on profiling people who didn't usually get media attention. She arrived at Victoria's penthouse at 3 p.m. with camera crew that was respectfully minimal. Sarah was early 40s, dressed in professional casual that suggested she understood the difference between business news and human interest. She shook Cameron's hand with genuine warmth that felt different from the transactional politeness he'd experienced from Victoria's lawyer. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for agreeing to this interview. I know the past few days have been overwhelming." They sat in Victoria's living room, cameras positioned to capture Cameron with the lake view behind him. Sarah asked her sound technician to check levels, then settled into her chair with notepad that suggested she'd done research beyond what Marcus had leaked. "Let's start simple. Tell me about your wife, Rachel. What was she like?" The question surprised Cameron because nothing in Marcus's leaked documents had included personal details about Rachel beyond her death. Sarah had clearly done independent research, found obituary or marriage records, decided that Cameron's story started before Victoria entered it. Cameron took a breath, letting himself remember Rachel in ways that didn't hurt quite as much as they used to. She was a nurse, pediatric ICU. She worked nights mostly, and she'd come home exhausted, but still find energy to play with Lily, to make breakfast feel special. Even when we were both running on no sleep. His voice caught. She was the kind of person who made hard things feel manageable just by being present. How did she die? Car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light. She was 8 months pregnant with our second child. Cameron heard his voice go flat, protective mechanism against grief that was still raw even after 3 years. I was supposed to pick her up from her shift, but I was running late from my delivery route. She decided to drive herself rather than wait. If I'd been on time. He stopped because finishing the sentence meant voicing the guilt he'd carried for 36 months, the calculation he ran every morning about how 10 minutes of being late had cascaded into losing everything that mattered. Sarah's voice was gentle. "That's a lot of weight to carry. Do you blame yourself?" "Every single day." "And Lily, how has she processed losing her mother?" Cameron glanced toward the hallway where Lily was playing in her room, Victoria reading to her from picture book about cats that Lily had selected from the pile they'd accumulated. "She still asks when mommy's coming home. We've explained death probably 200 times, but 4-year-olds don't process permanence the same way adults do. So I just keep explaining and hoping eventually it'll stick. That must be exhausting. Parenting is exhausting. Parenting while working 3 jobs to stay afloat is Cameron's search for adequate descriptor. It's survival mode. You just do what needs doing and try not to think about whether you're doing it well enough. Sarah made note on her pad. The article this morning characterized your employment situation as instability. But from what I understand, you work maintenance at the Regency Crown, drive delivery routes, and pick up catering shifts. That's not instability. Ay, that's someone working 60-plus hours a week to provide for their child. Thank you for recognizing the difference. So when you met Victoria Sterling, how did that happen? The official story says you met professionally about a year ago. Cameron had memorized the timeline Jennifer constructed, but sitting in interview with cameras recording felt different from rehearsing with a lawyer. This was permanent record story that would define him if he couldn't deliver it convincingly. We met at a conference where Victoria was speaking. I was doing maintenance work at the venue. We started talking during breaks, discovered we had more in common than our economic differences suggested. The lies came easier than they should, details Jennifer had crafted sliding into place. We both understood what it meant to lose people. Her mother died when she was 19. My wife died 3 years ago. That shared grief created connection that went deeper than what our bank accounts suggested was possible. And your relationship developed from there? Slowly. Neither of us was rushing into anything. I had Lily to consider, and Victoria had her career. But over time, we realized that we made each other's lives better. That having a partner who understood pressure made pressure more bearable. Sarah leaned forward slightly. The article suggests you're financially motivated, that you saw opportunity and took it. What do you say to people who think you're with Victoria for her money? Cameron let himself feel the anger that question deserved, let it show on his face because manufactured calm would look like guilt. I say they're revealing their own prejudices about class and worth. I work 3 jobs. I provide for my daughter. I pay my bills, even when paying them means choosing between electricity and groceries. If people think I need to marry someone for money, that says more about how they value human dignity than it does about my character. Do you love her, Victoria? The question hit harder than Cameron expected because he didn't have an answer he was confident about. What he felt for Victoria was complicated gratitude for how she treated Lily, respect for her competence, growing affection that might be love or might just be proximity. But saying any of that on camera would undermine the narrative they were constructing. I love that she reads to Lily without being asked. I love that she works 16-hour days and still finds energy to build block towers. I love that she understands what it means to survive loss without letting loss define you. Cameron paused. Whether that's romantic love or deep respect, I'm still figuring out. But I know she matters to me in ways that have nothing to do with her bank account. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, Sarah asking questions that let Cameron explain rather than defend, framing his story as working-class struggle rather than opportunistic gold-digging. When she finally called, cut her expression suggested genuine sympathy rather than journalistic satisfaction. That was powerful testimony, Mr. Brooks. I think people will see you differently after this airs. The segment ran on evening news at 5:00 p.m. and was online by 5:17. Cameron watched it from Victoria's couch. Lily cuddled against his side, Victoria sitting in the chair across from them with tablets showing social media reactions in real time. The response was mixed but trending more positive than the morning's article had been. Comments praising Cameron's honesty, people sharing their own stories of financial struggle, parents relating to the exhaustion of working multiple jobs while raising children alone. Not universal approval, plenty of people still thought Cameron was opportunist, but enough support that the narrative was shifting from gold digger targets CEO to hardworking father finds unexpected love. Victoria looked up from her tablet expression, carrying relief she'd been trying to hide. It's working. The tide's turning. But Cameron barely heard her because his phone was ringing with number he recognized, Kevin from the Regency Crown, his maintenance supervisor who'd given him the gala shift that started this entire situation. Kevin's voice was apologetic and resigned simultaneously. Brooks, I need you to come in tomorrow morning. HR wants to talk to you. Cameron's stomach dropped because he knew exactly what HR wanted to talk about. Am I being fired? The official position is that we're discussing your employment status in light of recent media attention. The unofficial position is that management is uncomfortable with maintenance worker who's now married to Sterling Capital's CEO doing repairs in hotel where Sterling executives hold business dinners. So yes, I'm being fired. I'm sorry, Cameron. You're good at your Kim, and I'd keep you if it were up to me. But this is coming from above my pay grade. Cameron ended the call and sat staring at his phone while his primary income source evaporated. $18 an hour, 40 hours a week, roughly $3,000 monthly before taxes. Gone because helping Victoria had made him too visible to remain anonymous maintenance worker. Victoria was watching him with expression that mixed guilt and calculation. What happened? I'm losing my job at the hotel. Apparently being married to you makes me too complicated to employ in service position. I'll make calls. I can pressure them to... No. Cameron's voice was sharper than intended. You've done enough. I agreed to help you knowing there'd be consequences. This is just consequences, arriving faster than expected. Cameron, you're losing income because you helped me. Let me fix this. By calling my boss and using your wealth and power to force them to keep employing me, that'll really convince people I'm with you for reasons other than money. Victoria fell silent because she recognized he was right, even if she didn't like it. They sat in uncomfortable quiet while Lily played with blocks, oblivious to adult problems that would eventually affect her through mechanisms she wouldn't understand until she was older. The Sterling Capital Board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning emergency session called because 3 board members had formally requested discussion of Victoria's recent marriage and its implications for company leadership. Victoria spent Wednesday night preparing presentation about Meridian Holdings' partnership financial projections that demonstrated why the deal was strategically sound, regardless of anyone's opinions about her personal life. Thursday at 8:47 a.m., Victoria's father, Thomas Sterling, arrived at the penthouse unannounced. Cameron answered the door because Victoria was in the shower and Lily was watching cartoons. Thomas was 68, tall like his daughter, with silver hair and bearing that suggested decades of commanding rooms full of people who were afraid to disagree with him. He looked at Cameron with assessment that was both professional and personal, evaluating the man his daughter had supposedly married. You must be Cameron Brooks. Mr. Sterling, Victoria didn't mention you were stopping by. That's because I didn't tell her I was coming. We need to talk, man to man, before this situation gets any more complicated. Cameron stepped aside and let Thomas enter, aware that refusing would only create confrontation that Victoria would have to manage later. Thomas moved through his daughter's penthouse with familiarity that suggested he'd been here many times, settling into the chair that seemed designated for authority figures having serious conversations. Cameron sat on the couch, maintaining posture that was respectful without being deferential. Thomas studied him with intensity that felt like being X-rayed, looking for weaknesses or lies or whatever markers wealthy fathers use to evaluate men who'd married their daughters. I'm going to be direct because I don't believe in wasting time on diplomatic phrasing. Did you marry my daughter for her money? No, sir. I married your daughter because she needed help, and I was in position to provide it. The statement was technically accurate given their fake marriage, but Cameron knew Thomas would interpret it as romantic narrative rather than transactional arrangement. But you are aware that she's extraordinarily wealthy, that marrying her provides you with financial security you've never had working maintenance jobs. I'm aware that Victoria has resources I don't have, but I'm also aware that asking someone to value me based on my character while simultaneously benefiting from their wealth would make me hypocrite. So I haven't touched a penny of her money and I don't intend to. Thomas's expression shifted slightly, reassessing. Victoria said you refused payment for helping her, that you're living here but maintaining your own expenses. Is that accurate? Yes, sir. Why, most people in your situation would take what they could get. Cameron thought about how to answer honestly without revealing their arrangement was fake. Because if I take her money, everyone who thinks I'm opportunist gets to be right. And I'd rather struggle financially than prove that the people judging me were correct all along. Thomas stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the lake view that probably reminded him of building his empire from nothing. When he turned back, his expression was less hostile, but no less serious. Marcus has been calling me multiple times a day, telling me that Victoria's judgment is compromised, that she's making emotional decisions, that this marriage is evidence she's not fit to run Sterling Capital. He paused. What do you say to that? I say Marcus is man who tried to take over your daughter's company after you chose her instead of him. And I say that his opinion about Victoria's judgment is less about her actual competence and more about him not being able to accept that she's better at running Sterling Capital than he ever was. Strong words from maintenance worker talking about venture capitalist I trained for 15 years. Respectfully, sir, I don't care what Marcus's credentials are. I care that he's been stalking your daughter for 6 months trying to destroy her career because she refused to marry him. That's not business strategy. That's abuse disguised as concern. Thomas's jaw tightened. Are you calling me blind for not seeing it? I'm saying that sometimes people closest to situations can't see what's obvious to outsiders. You trained Marcus. You groomed him to marry Victoria and help run your company. It must be hard to accept that the person you invested 15 years developing turned out to be someone who'd weaponized that trust. They stood in silence for a moment, Thomas processing Cameron's words with expression that suggested he wasn't used to being challenged by people without business degrees and stock portfolios. Finally, Thomas spoke, voice carrying less hostility than when he'd arrived. Victoria says you're good with Lily, that you're patient father. I try to be. Rachel was better at it than I am, but I'm learning. My wife died when Victoria was 19. Cancer that we fought for 2 years before accepting we were going to lose. Thomas's voice went quieter. I wasn't good at being both parents afterward, focused on business instead of helping Victoria process her grief. When she told me she was engaged to Marcus, I encouraged it because I thought she needed partner to share burden of running Sterling Capital. He turned to face Cameron directly. But maybe what she actually needed was someone who understood what it meant to lose person who defined your world and still have to keep functioning for people who depend on you. The vulnerability in Thomas's voice was unexpected crack in the authoritative facade revealing man who'd made mistakes he couldn't fix. Cameron didn't know how to respond, except with equal honesty. I don't know if I'm that person for Victoria. We're still figuring out what we are to each other. But I know that when she needed help, I was there. And I'll keep being there for as long as she needs me. Thomas studied Cameron for a long moment, then nodded with something that might have been approval. The board meeting is this morning. I'm going to recommend approval of the Meridian Partnership. And I'm going to tell the members who've been questioning Victoria's judgment that her personal life is none of their concern as long as Sterling Capital continues performing at current levels. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because Victoria's my daughter, and I should have been protecting her from Marcus instead of questioning her decisions. Thomas moved toward the door, then paused. But Cameron, if you hurt her, if you're playing some long game I can't see, I will use every resource I have to destroy you. Am I clear? Crystal clear, sir. After Thomas left, Cameron found Victoria standing in the hallway dressed for the board meeting in suit that probably cost what Cameron used to earn in a month. She'd clearly heard the entire conversation, had been waiting to see if Cameron would defend her to her father without her present. You didn't have to do that. Stand up to him. Yes, I did. Someone needed to tell him that Marcus's problem, not you. Victoria crossed the space between them and pulled Cameron into a hug that was tight enough to communicate emotions she wasn't voicing. He held her, aware that they were blurring lines between fake and real, faster than was probably safe. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with tears she was fighting. Thank you for everything, for lying to my father just now to protect our story, for defending me when you barely know me, for... I wasn't lying to your father. Everything I said about defending you from Marcus was true. The marriage might be fake, but my belief that you deserve better than what he's doing to you is real. Victoria stared at him like he'd said something profound instead of obvious. Then she kissed his cheek, brief, chaste, completely different from the desperate kiss that had started this entire situation, and left for the board meeting that would determine whether their gambit had worked. The evidence appeared by accident, the universe demonstrating that sometimes desperation led to preparation that looked like luck. Cameron had been going through papers Victoria had given him about Lily's enrollment at private school. She'd suggested forms requiring his financial information that would technically make him guardian on official documents. Mixed in with enrollment forms was folder labeled Sterling Capital, Executive Compensation Review. He'd opened it thinking Victoria had accidentally included work documents in papers meant for him. What he found instead made his hands start shaking. The folder contained financial records that shouldn't have existed outside secure servers, shell companies, offshore accounts, wire transfers that showed Marcus Ashford had been systematically embezzling from Sterling Capital for 4 years. $53 million moved through entities designed to hide ownership partnerships that existed only on paper investment funds that had no actual investors beyond Marcus himself. Cameron stared at the documents, trying to understand what he was seeing. The transfers had started small, 200,000 here, $500,000 there amounts, that would get lost in Sterling Capital's billion-dollar annual revenue. But they'd accelerated after Victoria became CEO. Marcus, apparently escalating theft, while simultaneously undermining her leadership. Cameron called Victoria, immediately interrupting her post-board meeting lunch with Meridian Holdings executives. Her voice was distracted, still in CEO mode. "Cameron, this isn't great timing. I'm in the middle. You need to see something now. It's about Marcus." The tone shift was immediate, professional polish dropping away. "What did you find?" "Evidence that's going to end his campaign permanently. But we need to secure it before he realizes it exists." Victoria arrived at the penthouse 47 minutes later with Jennifer Chen and 2 associates carrying equipment that looked designed for digital forensics. They spent 3 hours photographing documents, verifying authenticity through cross-referencing with public records, constructing legal case that would survive challenges from expensive defense lawyers. Jennifer's expression was grim satisfaction. "This is federal embezzlement. If these documents are authentic, Marcus is facing decades in prison. But we need to verify everything before going public, because if we're wrong, he'll sue for defamation and win." "They're real." Victoria's voice was hollow. "I recognize some of these accounts. Marcus used to handle executive compensation reviews before I became CEO. He had access to shell companies we use for legitimate tax optimization. He weaponized that access." By Friday evening, they'd verified enough documentation to approach federal prosecutors. Jennifer had contacts at the U.S. Attorney's Office who specialized in financial crimes. Saturday morning, 3 FBI agents arrived at the penthouse to interview Victoria about Marcus's access to Sterling Capital's financial systems. Sunday morning, Marcus showed up. He bypassed building security, somehow made it to the 41st floor, started pounding on Victoria's door at 8:23 a.m. while Cameron was making breakfast and Victoria was reading to Lily in the living room. His voice carried through the door, rage barely controlled beneath volume that suggested he'd been drinking or was having breakdown, or both. "I know you have them. Whatever documents you think you found, they're fake. You're trying to frame me because you can't handle that. I've been beating you legitimately." Victoria stood frozen, face draining of color. Lily looked up from her book with expression that showed she'd registered the adult fear, even if she didn't understand its cause. Cameron moved toward the door, pulling out his phone. Started recording before opening it because every instinct from emergency response training said document everything when situations escalated. Marcus was disheveled, suit, wrinkled hair, uncombed eyes carrying manic energy that suggested someone who'd lost control of narrative he thought he'd been managing. He saw Cameron and his rage redirected. "This is your fault. You show up and suddenly she finds documents that have been secured for 4 years. You planted them. You're working with her to destroy me." Cameron kept his phone recording voice calm in ways that only enraged Marcus further. "No one planted anything, and you need to leave before building security arrives. I will take everything from you." Marcus's voice dropped to something colder than shouting threat, delivered with precision that suggested he'd been planning this. "Your jobs, your custody, your pathetic excuse for life. I will make sure everyone knows you're using your daughter to manipulate Victoria. That you're exploiting your dead wife to gain sympathy. That you're—" He stopped himself, but not fast enough. Cameron's expression must have shown something dangerous, because Marcus backpedaled, recognizing line he'd just crossed. "I will destroy that little girl." Marcus's voice rose again, control slipping. I will make sure Child Protective Services investigates every aspect of your parenting. I will. Say that again. Cameron's voice was deadly quiet, still recording. About my daughter. Marcus seemed to realize his mistake the way rage had made him vocalize threats he'd meant to implement quietly. But the words were already recorded, Cameron's phone capturing every syllable of Marcus threatening 4-year-old child. Building security arrived 2 men who'd been called when Marcus bypassed front desk. They escorted him out while he continued shouting about fake evidence and conspiracies, voice echoing in the hallway even after the elevator doors closed. Cameron locked the apartment door and turned to find Victoria standing in the living room with Lily pressed against her side. His daughter was crying quietly, scared by shouting she didn't understand, and Victoria was stroking her hair with movements that suggested she'd been comforting crying children despite never having had any. Daddy, who was that man? Lily's voice was small. Why was he so mad? Cameron knelt down eye level with his daughter. That was someone who made bad choices and is upset about consequences. But he's gone now. Security won't let him come back. You're safe. He said mean things about you. Yes, he did. But mean things don't change truth. I'm still your dad, and Miss Victoria is still helping us, and that man doesn't get to change anything real just because he's angry. Lily nodded but clung tighter to Victoria, clearly shaken by adult rage she'd witnessed. Cameron looked up at Victoria over his daughter's head and saw her expression, something that mixed protective fury with dawning realization that Marcus had just handed them a weapon that would end his campaign permanently. I have it recorded, every threat, including the one about Lily. Victoria's voice was steady. Send it to Jennifer immediately and send copy to my father and to every board member who questioned my judgment about Marcus. The recording went viral within hours because Jennifer strategically leaked it to media outlets that had been covering Victoria's marriage. Audio of Marcus threatening 4-year-old child while making explicit threats about destroying Cameron's life played on every news station in Chicago by Monday morning. The narrative shifted instantly and completely. Marcus Ashford was no longer concerned board advisor, questioning CEO's judgment. He was unhinged ex-fiancé, threatening children on camera, while simultaneously embezzling millions from company he'd been trusted to protect. The Sterling Capital Board called emergency meeting Monday afternoon. Thomas Sterling formally recommended Victoria's Meridian Holdings partnership be approved unanimously. Every board member who'd questioned her judgment about Cameron issued formal apologies. Marcus was formally removed from all advisory positions. Federal prosecutors announced Tuesday morning they were charging Marcus with wire fraud, embezzlement, and multiple counts of financial crimes carrying maximum sentences that would keep him incarcerated until he was elderly. Wednesday afternoon, Victoria received confirmation that Meridian Holdings contracts were finalized. $2 billion in committed partnership capital. Sterling Capital stock hit record highs. Business press published think pieces about how Victoria had successfully navigated personal crisis while closing historically significant deal. Thursday morning, Cameron woke up in the guest room of Victoria's penthouse and realized that their agreed-upon 2 weeks had elapsed. The crisis they'd been managing was over. Marcus was facing federal charges. Victoria's position was secure. The Meridian contracts were signed, which meant their arrangement, the fake marriage, the living together, the constructed intimacy was no longer necessary. He found Victoria in her home office, staring at her laptop with expression he couldn't quite read. She looked up when he entered, and something flickered across her face that might have been the same realization he had just had. It's over. Her voice was carefully neutral. Everything we were trying to accomplish. Marcus is done. The partnership is over. You can go home now. The word home landed wrong because Cameron wasn't sure where home was anymore. The 2-bedroom apartment he'd been living in for 3 years felt distant and small compared to the space they'd been occupying. But this penthouse wasn't his home either. It was temporary refuge that had always had expiration date. Right, back to normal. Whatever normal means at this point. Victoria stood and walked to her windows, looking out at the lake view that Cameron had gotten used to waking up to. Her shoulders were tense in ways that suggested she was fighting some internal battle she wasn't ready to voice. I should thank you for everything, for lying to my board, for defending me to my father, for letting Marcus threaten your daughter so we'd have recording that would destroy him. Her voice cracked slightly. for pretending to be my husband well enough that I started believing it was real. Cameron crossed the office until he was standing beside her, both of them looking out at Chicago spreading beneath them, like promise of everything they couldn't quite articulate. What if I don't want to go back? Victoria turned to look at him, surprise evident. What What if these 2 weeks felt more real than anything in the past 3 years? What if living here with you and watching you read to Lily and building this, whatever this is, what if that matters more than maintaining the fiction that we're just helping each other through temporary crisis? Cameron, you don't want this. You don't want me. I'm complicated and damaged, and my life is never going to be the quiet existence you built for Lily. My life hasn't been quiet since Rachel died. It's been survival. Working 3 jobs and raising a daughter alone and pretending I'm okay when I'm barely functioning. But these 2 weeks, these have been the first 2 weeks in 3 years where I wasn't just surviving, where I actually felt like I might be learning to live again. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She was fighting. But what happens when the performance ends? When we're not pretending for boards and investors? What if the real version of us doesn't work as well as the fake one? Cameron took her hand, the gesture that had become familiar during their public performances, but which felt different now without audience to perform for. Then we figure it out. We take it slow. We let Lily adjust. We navigate all the complicated reality that comes after fake marriage ends and real relationship starts. But Victoria, I don't want to go back to my apartment and pretend these weeks didn't change everything. She pulled him into embrace that was tight enough to communicate what she couldn't voice: relief and terror and gratitude and all the emotions that complicated people felt when they realized they'd found connection they'd stopped believing was possible. When she finally spoke, her voice was muffled against his shoulder. Lily's going to think I'm crazy. Lily asked me last week if you were going to be her new mom. I think she's already made peace with this being real. They stood holding each other while the city moved beneath them, and Cameron understood that helping someone for 10 minutes had cascaded into helping for 2 weeks, had cascaded into realizing that sometimes the people you saved ended up saving you right back. They took it slow, despite neither of them being particularly good at slow. Cameron moved back to his apartment, but Victoria visited 3 times a week, learning to exist in spaces where furniture wasn't arranged by professionals, and dinner meant whatever Cameron could cook on a budget. Lily adjusted through asking questions. Why doesn't Miss Victoria live with us anymore? When is she coming back? Can we go to her house with the bubble bath? 6 months of slow revealed patterns they'd been too crisis-focused to notice. Victoria had control issues that made delegating impossible, worked 16-hour days, forgot to eat when stressed. Cameron had hypervigilance from 3 years of survival mode, struggled to accept help, carried guilt about Rachel that therapy was helping, but hadn't resolved. They attended family counseling, not couples therapy because they weren't technically couple yet, but sessions focused on blending their complicated histories into something that might work long-term. Lily had her own therapist, child psychologist, who specialized in helping kids process loss in family transitions. Cameron quit the delivery job but kept maintenance position at a different hotel, enrolled in night classes for engineering certification that Rachel had always encouraged. Victoria cut her hours at Sterling Capital, delegated more to her executive team, started attending Thomas's family dinners, where she'd previously made excuses to avoid. Marcus pleaded guilty to federal charges in exchange for reduced sentence, 15 years minimum. His trial would have destroyed Sterling Capital's reputation, so prosecutors accepted plea that kept details relatively private. Thomas visited him once and, holding a return looking older than his 68 years, never spoke about what they'd discussed. Victoria proposed on a Sunday afternoon in the park where Lily had been insisting they take her to feed ducks that weren't actually ducks but geese who were aggressive about bread distribution. They were walking back toward Cameron's apartment, Lily holding both their hands in configuration she called building a bridge, when Victoria stopped suddenly. I need to ask you something. You can say no. Most people would probably say no, but I have to ask. Lily looked up with curious expression that suggested she sensed something important was happening. Cameron raised an eyebrow, waiting. Victoria knelt down to Lily's level. First, the gesture she'd learned meant you were having serious conversation with children. Lilybug, I need to ask your dad something important, but I wanted to ask you first if it would be okay with you. Lily's eyes went wide. Are you going to ask if you can be my real mom? Sort of. I'm going to ask your dad if he wants to marry me for real this Chimicum, not pretend like we were doing before, actually married, which would mean I'd be in your family permanently, but only if that's okay with you. Lily didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around Victoria with force that nearly knocked her over. Yes, 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 I want you to be my mom forever. Victoria caught Cameron's eye over Lily's shoulder, and he saw vulnerability there that she'd been hiding throughout their months of slow. This wasn't CEO making strategic move. This was woman who'd found family she'd stopped believing existed and who was terrified of being rejected. Cameron pulled them both into embrace that felt like answering question without words. But Victoria apparently needed actual words because when they separated, she looked at him expectantly. Is that a yes? That's a yes to all of it. The marriage, the family, the complicated, messy, beautiful reality of building life together. Yes, Lily cheered with volume that attracted attention from other park visitors. Victoria laughed through tears, pulled Cameron close, and kissed him with none of the desperation from the gala 2 years ago. This was kiss that tasted like hope instead of panic, future instead of survival. They were married 6 months later in ceremony that was still small, but significantly less fictional than the courthouse wedding Jennifer Chen had invented. Thomas walked Victoria down the aisle. Mrs. Rodriguez stood as Cameron's best friend tissues ready. Lily was flower girl who took her duties very seriously, scattering petals with concentration that made the entire audience laugh. At the reception, Thomas approached Cameron during the dancing expression, carrying something that might have been approval or might have been resignation, that his daughter was happy in ways he hadn't predicted. You kept your promise. You've been there for her. I'll keep being there for as long as she'll have me. My wife used to say that the measure of a man wasn't what he did when success was easy. It was what he did when survival was hard. Thomas paused. You survived and helped her survive simultaneously. That's rare. Cameron didn't know how to respond except with honesty. I'm still figuring out this whole being married to a CEO thing. Pretty sure I'm going to mess it up regularly. Good. Marriage that's too perfect isn't real. Marriage that survives imperfection is worth having. Years later, Cameron would think back to the night Victoria had grabbed his collar in desperate panic and wonder what would have happened if he'd said no. If he'd extracted himself from the situation and returned to his 3 jobs and careful invisibility, he'd probably still be working maintenance, still barely surviving, still teaching Lily that life was struggle to be endured rather than gift to be experienced. Instead, he'd said yes to helping someone for 10 minutes, which had become 2 weeks, which had become lifetime of waking up next to someone who understood that survival was just the first step toward actually living. Lily grew up asking when people needed help, were you supposed to help them? And Cameron would say yes, always yes, because sometimes helping someone changed your life in ways you couldn't predict, but which turned out to be exactly what both of you needed.